Welcome back to another episode with Fight Night Picks. As always, we're brought to you by SimBody. Vertiball is now SimBody. If you head on over to their website, simbody.com, you're going to get all the great products that you know and love, including the SimBody Vertiroller and the Vertiball that you have seen most likely here in studio. Look at that. Place it, lock it, attach it, Vertiball, all sorts of great stuff over there if you want to roll out those old tired muscles and you don't want to go with that old lacrosse ball. They're also coming out with that very new product that you can see right in front of you. And if I head on over to my cart, look at that. I've already got a Vertiball over there. Little bit of a deal right there. And if you hit the try for 60 days risk-free, use the promo code FNP and you're going to get 10% off your order. With that code FNP at simbody.com, you're really helping out another local company here in New Brunswick, Canada. Can't wait for it. The new name, SimBody at simbody.com. And as we always say, let's get into it.
Ladies and gentlemen, recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. It's time for Fight Night Picks with your hosts, Frank and Matt Allen.
Oh boy, and just like that, we're back and we're set for another week with Fight Night Picks. UFC Orlando coming up this weekend. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson taking on Kevin Holland in the main event. And listen, it's a longer week. It's one that starts on a Thursday with Fight Night Picks, and this is the very first time. Will it be the last, or will there be more iterations of this? But we're going live to talk about the entire card. We're going to do our best to hit up the chat. Hot Pepper Boy is definitely feeling it coming up this weekend. Connor is saying the hoodies are fresh. I get the Real Deal Holyfield Matt with the Lakers. But Matt, we're going to do our best, like I said, to get into that chat. But we're going to focus on the nitty-gritty so it doesn't take 3 hours to do the 15 fights that you have coming up on this card. Again, headlined by Wonderboy versus Stephen Thompson in the poster. We've got those palm trees in the background. And the reason we're doing this on a Thursday was because I was around some palm trees, which I found out they actually have to bring into Vegas because palm trees aren't really a thing. But yes, of course, I was in Vegas to see the Golden Knights, the Grand Canyon, and so on and so forth. And it was a great vacation. It was the first one, like real one, since 2020. So there were a lot of people that were hitting up the chat, hitting up the Instagram, hitting up Twitter. When's the episode going to come out? Live on a Thursday, a little bit different. So, like I said, going to do our best over there in the chat. CNY Smash Bros is having a good time, saying that we're live. Tyler as well. So, Matt, when we do look at this overall card, I know you're really excited because it might feel when you have 15 fights, it might be quantity over quality, but we have a mix of both on this one.
We definitely do, and Wonderboy Thompson doesn't necessarily fight as often as he used to at one point. Like, we are very far removed from UFC 205 when he initially fought Tyron Woodley for the title. Like, that was a big deal back then, and that's when he was a much more active fighter than he is now. But we had looked it up because I was kind of in disbelief about it, how Kevin Holland is not a ranked fighter in the welterweight division. But that's the great thing about Wonderboy Thompson. He is a great litmus test for anybody in the rankings or outside of the rankings looking to make their imprint. And for Kevin Holland, we all know how talented he is. I really do think that his biggest detractor when he fought at middleweight was the size. It wasn't really any skills that he brought into the cage. He is a good offensive grappler. He's a decent defensive grappler. Of course, he's not going to be able to wrestle guys like Usman and Covington, but still, he's not some zero on the map by any means. And we all know how tight of a striker he is, how snappy of a striker he is. So I think this is a really fun fight against Wonderboy. And for Wonderboy, it's kind of interesting. I don't really know where he goes with a win in this fight. We talked about this with Derek Lewis kind of previously, how with a win, you don't really know what happens because he's fought everybody in the rankings. With Wonderboy, he is in the same boat. He has fought every ranked fighter in this division, so I'm not really sure what a win does for Wonderboy, but it definitely helps Kevin Holland get towards the title.
The last chat about the vacation, Connor saying they're from the greatest city in the world, Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. Okay, so I got back yesterday afternoon. I left Vegas at midnight, flew all night, Chicago, Montreal, Fredericton. And while we were leaving Vegas, the guy that took my bags, he had to check my ticket to make sure he knew where I was going and the bag was going to the right spot. And he goes, Fredericton, where's that? And I went, an hour east of Maine. And he goes, I've never heard of that city. And as we're walking away, he's talking to his buddy. He's like, I have no idea where that is at all. So I don't
You're like the Ultimate Warrior from parts unknown.
Brian saying, are the boys Leafs fans?
Opposite of that.
Canadians fans and an occasional Vegas Golden Knights fan when I follow them and travel along. But Matt, the last thing I'll say before we throw it on over to the fight of the night screen, last card that you had, Spivak versus Lewis, both those guys fall out. You had two ranked fighters, and one fighter was ranked the week of the fight. On a 3-fight win streak, 3 years in the making, it was Marina Moroz taking on Jennifer Maia. On this card, Thompson's ranked, RDA, Nicolau, Schnell, Tuivasa, Pavlovich, Hermanson, Hill, Ducote, Cortez and Ribas. We have 11 ranked fighters on this card. Matt, it's time to throw it on over to the fight of the night. Let us know over in the chat, in the comment section below, who you have on the fight of the night screen. And it kicks off with Matheus Nicolau taking on Matt Schnell. Matt Schnell's last 2 fights, fight of the nights. And I have a lot to talk about that when we get into the fight. But you watch this guy, and it's absolutely balls to the wall. And for Nicolau, he had back and forth moments. He lost to, who was it? It was Dustin Ortiz, and then he was outside of the UFC.
Yeah,
had that fight, comes back into the UFC. He's sporting a squeaky clean record. He just can't lose. And he dropped my boy in the second round of his last fight, David Dvorak. And he looked really good in that fight, too. So, Matt, I think this is going to be an amazing fight. And Connor's saying anything with Ty is a fight of the night, in my opinion. But there's always 2 picks on this one.
I think this is a really fun fight. Matt Schnell has proven that anytime he's in the cage, he is going to eat some big power shots, and he's probably going to get dropped at some point. But he tends to act fairly well after that. He responds very positively. He does tend to take the fight to his opponents, and we saw how effective his grappling was when he gets on top of his opponent. He is a very damaging ground and pound fighter. He has good submissions too, and that has been a bit of a weakness for Nicolau. We know how good of a boxer he is and how heavy-handed he is, but he does have a bit of an Achilles heel with the wrestling, so we could see Schnell get on top of Matheus Nicolau and really look good. But on the flip side, Nicolau does land some big bombs on the feet, so it'll be interesting to see if Schnell can eat those shots.
And then if we have a look at the second pick here, I mean, Niko Price does no boring fight. He's taking on Philip Rowe. Now, for Phil Rowe, it's been an interesting road. Loses UFC debut, and it seemed to me like it was almost, first-time jitters that he had in that fight. Really couldn't get going. His next time out, the Kosi fight that he had, it was a little bit of back and forth. But his last 2 fights finishes on the legend. For Price, has been out just over a year since he took on Alex Oliveira, beat him by decision. Who knows how many kids he has at this point for Niko Price? Kind of like Alex Oliveira in that respect. Wow. But both of these guys, again, they don't know a boring fight. MPTV, wait, this is live?
It is.
Hell yeah, it is actually live. So, Matt, when we do look at this fight, I know you're excited about it too.
Oh yeah, I love watching Niko Price fight because he does not know how to knock it into a brawl. He loves eating power shots to give his own power shots. And he's a bit of a wonky striker. He does like to make kind of big mistakes, if we're being honest. He'll lead with his chin sometimes to then land his own really powerful straight shots because it's weird. He is a tall, rangy guy for the weight division, but he does crash forward a lot with his strikes, and then that does tend to incite a brawl. So I think it's a great fight, and in a similar way that I mentioned how Wonderboy is kind of a gatekeeper to the top fighters in the welterweight division, I feel like Niko Price is kind of a gatekeeper to just being a good, relevant fighter in this division. If you beat Niko Price, great things always tend to happen to you.
Matt, we will talk about this card a little bit more right here because, again, 11 ranked fighters on this one. It's Thompson's 8th main event. Kevin Holland, it's his 3rd. And if you do look at it, I mean, listen, we do have a rookie debut. Francis Marshall is the rookie competing on Dana White's Contender Series this past summer. He got a big win there, took the O from a fellow undefeated fighter. You'll see a bit of a preview of that fight with a preview from our Contender Series show, but you also have second time out for Yazmin Jauregui out of Mexico, Genaro Valdez also out of Mexico, and Emily Ducote, the former strawweight champ, over with Invicta. And I don't know if you saw it on Twitter, but they showed that highlight win that she had over Danielle Taylor. What an amazing one over there. This is just the 4th event to take place at the Amway Center in Orlando. In 2018, Josh Emmett, Jeremy Stevens. Brutal finish in that one. The next one, 2015, RDA, Cowboy. That was a title fight win there for RDA. He's also on this card in the co-main event. And then before that, the inaugural fight in 2014, a wild start to that one. I don't know if you know what it is. I'm pulling the punches here. Fabrizio Verdun when he ran across the cage and threw a head kick, just jumping off the side against Travis Brown. So, Matt, I think this is going to be a very fun fight card. 15 fights total. There's not going to be any filler. There's not going to be any of the bits between with the names and so on and so forth. And, hey, there's no little cards that are going to have our picks on them. So you got to listen in carefully for those picks. Eager to see what people are thinking over there in the comment section. And, Matt, with that, here we go. Let's start with the first fight on this card. Yazmin Jauregui, she's taking on Istela Nunes, a battle of strikers at strawweight. And for both of these women, again, second time out for the former UWC and then Combate tournament champion Jauregui. And in her UFC debut, they didn't give out a fight of the night, but oh my gosh, her fight against Yazmin Lucindo. Let's start it here because Jauregui was a decent favorite in that fight. She was around a -200 or a little bit more. I think it was -195, in about there. you look at that fight, and for Lucindo, she kind of looked like a Natalia Silva in that fight.
Little bit,
we
yeah.
did not expect the striking of Lucindo to look that good in that fight, and I never thought Natalia Silva was going to look as good as she has in the UFC. So when you look at that fight, Matt, when you look at Jauregui versus Lucindo, were there things you were able to gain out of rewatching that one, getting ready for this?
I was just really impressed by both fighters, and that has to be said. Like, I think that's one of those fights where both fighters do gain stock as the result. But for Jauregui, I do really like the volume that she demonstrated in that fight, and that's really going to be a key in this matchup against Nunes, because, let's be honest, there is not a lot of TKO stoppages in this strawweight division. There just isn't. Unless Jessica Andrade comes walking into that cage, because she is a legit threat, she can knock you out at 145. That is how dangerous that woman is. But down at this division, volume really is queen, I guess, if you want to say it that way. Like, think about Joanna. Even at the height of her powers, yes, she had a couple TKOs earlier on in her career, but that's really because she was able to outmatch some of those defenders. It was Jessica Penne, Carla Esparza, who early in their career weren't great strikers. For Jędrzejczyk, she was really able to wow them with her volume, and I think for Jauregui, that's how she's going to be able to at least win this fight. I'm not saying she is the next Jędrzejczyk by any means, but I really do think that volume is going to be able to carry her while she's facing these other primary strikers. Now, when she faces a primary wrestler who's really going to test her and just get into the clinch and dirty box a lot, that'll be a story for another day, but I do like Yazmin, at least with her stylistic matchup.
The thing that weirds me out about this fight, and I knew the comments were going to come in, and this is just kind of the nature of the beast doing the show live, so we're going to go through a few of them right here. So Cena is saying, can't believe Nunes fought Angela Lee. So that was over with one championship. She had won a couple of fights. Now, one thing. For Istela Nunes, her record coming into her last fight, it was 7-2 with a no contest. One of her fights was a Muay Thai fight. It was thrown out there on Twitter a few years ago. Finally, that's been corrected. So that's why it's now 6-3 at this point. She has been defeated in both of her UFC fights. She signed to the UFC a long time ago, had a 2-year USADA suspension due to stanozolol, and then made that debut after a few fights falling out. But when you do look at it, like MPTV says, Nunes has been underwhelming. Yazmin the opposite. I wonder what's going to happen. First Last saying, I feel like Nunes is very limited as a striker, especially her grappling. This really feels like Yazmin's fight to lose. Istela Nunes is definitely limited as a grappler. And inside of the UFC's Octagon, all of those camps have taken place at ATT. And some of the names that I threw down here for her that she trains with, Karolina Kowalkiewicz, you've got Ariane Lipski, you've got Marina Moroz, Jasmine Jazz Divisius, Maeda Bueno Silva. Like, you have some big names to train with at American Top Team. But for Nunes, she can defend some of those early takedown attempts because her movement's really good. She moves great side to side. She's really speedy. She switches stances, which is something that even on my graphic right here, it might not illustrate that because I have it as orthodox, but she will switch because when she goes southpaw, she throws that back foot as a left head kick quite a bit to really throw off her opponents. But Nunes has really good boxing and a lot of power on that back hand, that dominant hand. So whether it's southpaw, most likely orthodox, she'll throw out the left hook and then throw a straight right hand down the pipe. And she can damage her opponents. And if you go back and watch the Sam Hughes fight, great first round.
Oh, yeah.
Second round, pulls about even.
What do we
Hughes
say
looked
about
pretty good.
Hughes, though?
Third round, Hughes took over, and Hughes gained a point because there was an eye poke from Nunes that was called. So if it was 29-27, if that's how he scored it, that's how that fight went. But for Istela Nunes, the trouble's been the cardio and the takedown defense inside the UFC's Octagon. Through both of those fights that she's had in the UFC. She didn't look terrible in the second round against Hughes. It could have gone either way, but regardless, it was either a draw or a win for Hughes. And in that one, after the first round, they showed the graphic on the screen. Nunes was a minus 1,000 favorite after round number 1. So I do kind of worry a bit about this fight when you do really look at it, because if you do look at Yazmin Jauregui, boxing really is her specialty. I don't really know how she could perform if she does have to fight from southpaw. But for Jauregui, really high and tight guard, a lot of volume with it. The one thing that scared me a little bit in that debut against Lucindo was very much one shot, one kill, power over anything. Daniel Cormier said this after a couple of good flurries. He said, she's very fast, she's very good, but she doesn't exit as quickly as she should after she lands a combination, which is something that I started to notice just even in the regional scene fights. And for her, she won that Combate championship. She did have a couple of one-round fights. One went to a decision, so 5 minutes, decision.
Teddy Atlas calls that not waiting for the receipt.
The other fight, she ends up getting the finish, and then she wins the belt. But for Jauregui, for as good as her boxing is, her leg kicks really do play out quite well. 18 attempted in the first round of her last fight, 10 in the second round, 6 in the third round, and it's a big, big part of her game.
It is. I just think, and I kind of gave it away in originally, I don't think Nunes' power is great enough to stop Yazmin in this matchup. So unless she is able to really start to damage her, that means get cuts, like start to swell up her eyes and such. I do think the volume of Yazmin is going to be overwhelming in this matchup, because that's the thing. If you're worried about your opponent throwing, and if you're trying to defend your opponent's shots, there's not going to be those openings for then you to land your own shots. And I think Nunes is going to struggle with that. Like, there has been nothing from Nunes' 2 first fights in the UFC for me to think, wow, now she's going to be able to all of a sudden benefit from the training at ATT and beat someone like Jauregui, who, again, she might not become a ranked fighter. I guess this isn't the deepest division in the world, and the way that the UFC seems to be promoting her, maybe she will find her way to the rankings sooner rather than later, but I think she has shown enough promise to be excited for her career moving forward.
So, I haven't looked at the odds, but we'll bring them up on Best Fight Odds. So this is the part where it seems like amateur hour, but when you're live, that's how it works. Jauregui open -240, -332, and if you look at Nunes, open +205, +255. We have a look at the Tapology votes, Matt, and this is live, so listen, we're going to guess. You don't know them, we don't know them.
Idea.
I'm going to say over under 80% Jauregui in this one.
Probably over.
Probably over. Yeah, it's way over. 1,888 votes, 95% Jauregui, 67% by decision, 22% by knockout. For the 5% that have Nunes, 61% by decision. And it's weird to see somebody like Nunes go from a favorite last time out against Sam Hughes, which could have gone the other way. I mean, again, third round and eye poke, draw was the best thing that she could hope for. And in her fight against Carnelossi, decent first round, decent second round. Third round, finally, the takedown defense, she gets submitted. But if you do look at it for Nunes, like at a +225, it's kind of weird, but when I look at Jauregui, she kind of does remind me of her training partner out of Entram Gym, like a younger Silvana Gomez Juarez that's pieced it together. So for me, I have Jauregui, but it's ever so slightly. I'm surprised, like first, last over there in the comment section. Wow, at the 95%, that there's that many people going with Jauregui and that she's that big of a favorite. But I think, undefeated, little bit of a promotional push. I think Jauregui gets the win.
I like Yazmin in this matchup. I really do. I think her volume is going to be overwhelming.
All right, Matt. So we move on to our next fight. This is going to be really tough on the talking. But when we look at this one, we have Marcelo Rojo, Entram Gym, taking on Francis Marshall, the Fire Marshal. And when I do these videos, I go out and I listen to interviews and I watch the fight tape and I watch the regional fight stuff. And we did a bit of a breakdown. This is going to give me a chance to get a drink before we get into this too far. But on Francis Marshall's UFC debut on, really, it was Dana White's Contender Series, he had a really interesting fight that came up this past summer. So we're going to throw it on back to our Contender Series breakdown, and then we're going to insert the portion about Marshall versus Rojo, because I think this is a really interesting fight and a clash of styles as well.
Certainly.
You know the guys from Fight Night Picks for their weekly UFC previews and predictions, live shows like Question Mark Kicks and the Sidekick. Thanks to your support, they're adding a new show to the channel. If you're an MMA fan, you're going to want to join in the action of Dana White's Contender Series. So as they always say, let's get into it.
Next fight, at 145 pounds, you have undefeated 5-0 squaring off. Francis Marshall taking on Connor Matthews. And don't get it twisted. Like, to me, these guys seem like Ultimate Fighter guys. Like, we have the Ultimate Fighter finale coming up this weekend, heavyweight and women's flyweight. These two guys just have experience against lesser levels of competition. I mean, whether it's with CES, Cage Titans, so on and so forth, when I'm talking about Connor Matthews, or for Francis Marshall on some of those lower scales. I mean, you go through their overall records. I mean, 9 of their 10 total wins are by finish combined, and 5 first-round finishes for Matthews, but he's got that dreaded win, his second to last time out. He beat Jay Ellis. And listen, Jared Mearshart couldn't do it, but a lot of men have. Like, over 90 have done it. So, big opportunity there, but I think it's going to be a fun fight for what it's worth.
This feels like one of those fights where no matter what happens to the winner, they get a developmental contract and not the real UFC contract. I know they haven't done that as much lately. That was very much a Season 1 and Season 2 platform, but right now I could see them doing that for Marshall or Matthews, because like you said, it feels like an Ultimate Fighter fight, because I'd like to see them 2, 3, 4 more times against some kind of regional levels of talent, because I do really like Marshall's wrestling. I think that's a good X factor that you can bring to the cage. And for Connor Matthews, he has nice striking when he is able to put his combinations together to their fullest effect. But again, they're both these skill sets that I'd like to see a few more times before they get that shot at the bigger show.
So you look at that fight, and then we focus in on this one. And for Francis Marshall, it really was his wrestling that won him that fight against Matthews. And for Matthews, a little bit of a backstory or a little bit more on it. He was a first-round finisher type of fighter, so it's kind of interesting that we go back to that video, because I know you had talked about the fact, kind of felt like an Ultimate Fighter fight. Both guys were 5-0. Marshall ends up getting the contract. He's in the UFC, and, well, who do you book him with? And they went with Marcelo Rojo, who has a ton of experience, and he was on the Ultimate Fighter Latin America Season 3. He lost to Claudio Poyas. I saw the highlight floating around on Twitter where he throws the flying knee, hits him with a flying knee, and then gets taken down by Poyas. But when you do look at it for Rojo, all of that experience, the 2 fights in the UFC, both of them losses against really good levels of competition. Charles Jourdain and Kyler Phillips as well. And some of the fights that have fallen out for him, fights against Kevin Kroom, BKFC legend, Jonathan Martinez, and Daniel Willycat. Like, you look at those names, and it's just kind of weird to see that for Rojo to be taking on a guy like Francis Marshall.
You just worry about how much Rojo has left in the tank, or at least I do, because he's been fighting with this style his whole entire career. It's not like he just became an action fighter when he came to the UFC. This is a guy who left...
Campbell McLaren was able to squeeze the lemon.
Exactly. And it really comes down to how much juice is now left in that lemon. Like, it has very much been discarded. Like, I don't know if you guys have country markets where you guys live, but they make orange juice at these places, and it's the greatest thing ever. It is worth whatever price they put on it, but you always see in the back there's just a bunch of boxes full of squeezed lemons, anyways, or oranges. With Rojo, I do worry about the amount of damage he has taken. Like, think back to the pictures that came out after he fought Charles Jourdain. He looked like the Elephant Man. His eyes were closed, his nose was broken. That is damage that you don't ever really come back from. I know the swelling goes away, the bones get set, but you can't continue to fight like that for the rest of your life. And I know Marshall might not be the guy who takes advantage of some of those aspects. Maybe he isn't as heavy-handed as some of those guys that you have mentioned, because you're right. If you're 0-2 against guys like Kyler Phillips and Charles Jourdain, it's no shame whatsoever. You just gotta worry about how much he has left in the tank, because for Rojo, he starts to wind down as the fight goes on. Marshall, the last time out, like you had mentioned, faced a first-round finisher. This time, it's a very different test. He's facing another primary striker, but Rojo can take the fight much later. The question I have, though, is how much can Rojo still put his foot on the gas? Because I feel like the more he lets go with his own offense, it's going to make him more susceptible to not only the takedown, but the shot on the feet, too. So I guess for me, it just comes down to how much does Rojo still have left?
Well, and if you look at it for Francis Marshall, a guy that trains out of a gym that you might be surprised by right there, Pellegrino MMA. His dad brought him there when he was 13, so he started training in MMA. Then he started training in wrestling, so he wrestled in high school, and now it's all come together. And I mean, you know, he's young, he's 23 years old, got his whole life ahead of him. And if you look at it, his nickname on certain sites, but the UFC haven't carried it over, is Francis Fire Marshall, and he's actually a full-time fireman. For this camp, I listened to an interview by John Eric Poley over with My MMA News. My gosh, that guy's professional. Like, full suit and tie doing the interviews. And it was a really good one, so go check it out. You got to give props where you can. But he said that he was able to kind of take off from firefighting to get ready for this fight. But there's going to be some of the guys from the station make the trip down to Orlando to watch him fight. So I thought that was really cool. But if you listen to it for Marshall and you look at it training out of Pellegrino, I mean, Pellegrino had 10 fights in the UFC, and what was he known for? Wrestling and jiu-jitsu. What's Francis Marshall known for? Wrestling, taking your back, and getting rear naked chokes. And of his overall wins, 5 as an amateur, 6 as a pro, undefeated in all of them, 6 of them by submission, 5 of them by rear naked choke, and he does take the back. And for Rojo, you can see it on screen, 6 wins by submission, but if I scroll down to the losses, 5 losses by submission. So it is a little weird that way, but I will say this, Matt, and the reason why I set it up at the start this way, and I want to kind of carry that conversation on just for a bit if I may, for Marshall, in that fight that he had on Contender Series, he struggled mightily in the striking in the first round. He just kind of kept his head on the center line, got punched down. He didn't really have any answers for the striking. He's got a decent one too, but it's all to get the takedown and then threaten with. He's got good ground and pound, and again, like I said, he likes to take the back. Struggled with that, and then in the third round, when his opponent was gassed, he really took over, but it was with his striking, and I don't see him having those successes in a fight like this against Marcelo Rojo. So, again, for Rojo, struggled against Charles Jourdain. He did have some moments in that fight, and his last win that he had by submission was way back a long time ago in 2017. If you look at it his last time out, only the 8th triangle armbar in UFC history by Kyler Phillips. You don't see that very often, but for Marshall, it just, for Rojo, it seems like a big step down to Marshall, and for Marshall, it's a big step up from Matthews in this one.
I think for Rojo, though, it is warranted. Like, at a certain point, you can't just keep on feeding the guy killers. What are they going to do, wait for John Lineker to come back and feed him to Rojo? Like, for Rojo...
Andrade, that's what they got to do.
I guess. It just, for Rojo, I do like the step down for him. And for Marshall, you're right. Since he is so young, maybe we will continue to see so many different sides of him and an evolution in his game. Because he does feel like a fighter that once he is able to add, maybe not a complete striking repertoire, but again, Marvin Vettori tends to be the fighter who we reference when it's, hey, you have this great grappling package, your striking's good but not great against the elite strikers. So what do you have to get good at? Striking your way into the clinch and then taking your opponent down. If Marshall can show the ability to just defend himself from the big shot of
Can't
Rojo,
cut that when it's live.
you can't. Then I do think Rojo could have some success. I do think this is going to be a tale of two very different fights, because you're right. Marshall did not look very good on the feet his last time out, especially early on. He did seem kind of robotic, and that's the issue. Rojo does move quite well on the feet, especially early on in the fight. He is willing to throw a lot of combinations, so again, my real question mark is, how much can Marshall improve between every single fight, and how much does Rojo still have left in the tank? Because I know he's not the oldest guy in the world, but you can't really judge fighters by how old they are by when they were born. It's really the amount of tough fights that they've been in, and Rojo has been in so many tough fights, it is getting uncountable.
Dave Baker's in the chat, always out there with the picks. I've got Marshall here, can't stick around for long. Great job as always, guys. I really do appreciate it. Never heard the nickname Pitbull before from Drew. Yeah, that one's a little overused. So overused that brothers pick it.
Who's your favorite Pitbull? I know it isn't overused.
Andrei Arlovsky.
Thank you, that's who my pick was going to be.
Francis Marshall open at even. He's a minus 163 favorite. Marcelo Rojo open minus 110, plus 135. Where has he been training for this camp? It's been training in the States, so we'll see how that one plays out for him. If you have a look at the Tapology votes, Matt, see, can't cut this stuff. Surprise to us as it is to you. This is going to be a lot of talking, folks. I'm going to say over, under, 70% Marshall. I don't know if everybody's going to be
I think it's going to be over. Or, sorry, under.
Under. It's over.
Wow.
So 1,883 total votes, 82% Marshall, 39% by decision, 46% by submission. For the 18% that have Rojo, 48% by knockout, 37% by decision. So we haven't really made a pick on this one yet. Who are you going with?
I like Marshall in this fight, but I think he's going to face a lot of adversity. I don't think it's just going to be a matter of him getting on top of Rojo, grounding him out, and then maybe getting a submission afterwards. But I do like him as this fight goes late. That's the thing about Rojo. If he is going to have a lot of success, he is a great striker, don't get me wrong. But he's not necessarily a one-hitter quitter on the feet.
No.
He is going to use a lot of volume to get you out of there. So maybe he can have success, especially early on in this fight. But I think that the more success he has without getting a finish is going to start to drain his own gas tank. And if that is the case, Marshall's a guy who can come on late, especially with his grappling. So I think if Marshall does get on top of him, maybe he is down 2 rounds, which is not a place I'd want to be, but still, maybe he is down 2 rounds. I like his grappling that much, especially with his top game, with his ability to strike his way into his submission. And that's the thing too, his grappling feeds into itself. He's not just going to try to, play around on top, kind of Jake Shields you. He does have very effective ground and pound from the guard and the half guard too, and I think that can open up a submission opportunity as this fight goes late.
Behind the curtain, before the video, we were kind of talking like Wonderboy, Holland, what does a win do? Actually, no, we said that on here. And like, you've got guys like Bilal Muhammad, Sean Brady. I see this fight like Bilal Muhammad, Sean Brady, and Brady in this case is Marshall. Like, he's a guy that the striking is continuing to develop. He's only 23. He's got a squeaky clean record. Takedowns are great. Submissions are great. I don't know how he's going to make out against the resistance like he will face when he takes on a guy like Rojo. He was able to come out clean against Matthews, and he looked really good in that win. And what was it, 30-26, 30-27-27? Or maybe there were 2 30-26s peppered in there. He looked great in that fight, and he's looked great against the lower level competition. Like, he fought Ray Trujillo, that's fought everybody on the regional scene. But for Rojo, the thing that I love in a matchup like this, he's hot and heavy on leg kicks, and he's a guy that will continue to attack that lead leg. Did it against Jourdain, got finished in the 3rd round. Did it against Kyler Phillips in that fight. I don't know what Francis Marshall looks like when he switches stances. That's my big key to this fight. So for me, I'm going to go with Marcelo Rojo in this one. Hot dogs. Honestly, boys, this flow works better. It's way too hard for us to talk for an hour and a half on these. We'll see how it goes. But listen, we're split on the pick. I've got Rojo, Matt going with Francis Marshall. Big suck a win, and then we get
It's a fun fight, though.
It is a fun fight, and then we get into another fun fight. Natan Levy, representing Israel, a guy who trained karate for 5 years in Japan, a guy who was born in Paris, from Israel, now trains out of the States. He's trained at a Syndicate MMA and Extreme Couture. He is the most interesting man in the world. Natan Levy is going to be taking on Genaro Valdez, an interesting brawler who is no more than that, but always more than that. Matt, when I went back and I did the tape study for this fight, this is what I went in with a preconceived notion before I wrote any notes.
Let's hear it.
Genaro Valdez is a boxer brawler, and that's all he does. Natan Levy is a black belt in Kung Fu and a black belt in Karate. Train those disciplines where they were created, so he's probably good at those things. And then I watched the tape, and neither one of these guys do either of those things. They go out there and do that for a little bit until it gets boring, and then they start wrestling. And it's against wrestlers that they'll wrestle. So they have the weirdest styles to fight each other, and they have the weirdest styles in general, and I don't know if either one's going to crack a top 15, and I think this is going to be one of those fights where everybody's like, what? They told me this was going to happen, and then I get this.
It is a weird fight. Now, maybe for me, it's always stood out more with Levy, because I do think of him as that karate style of a fighter. And when you look at his stance, he kind of starts out that way. He's light on his feet, but he does like to shoot in from a far distance. And that's the thing about both these guys. I don't think either one of them is going to touch the rankings, especially in this weight division. It's very difficult to become a ranked fighter at 155 pounds. You have to go on like 7-8 fight win streaks, and then maybe you'll get like a co-main event of a fight night against a former champion. And yeah, good luck with that stuff. So I think it is a very tall mountain to climb, but for Levy, he does like to shoot for a lot of takedowns. And you know that meme of that guy with the ponytail and like the 2 knee braces doing those like wrestling like slides across the mat, maybe? Anyways, Levy does shoot from really far distance away, and it always worries me. If he does fight a very high level counter striker, you can see that being an opportunity for them to really hit him, because he does like to operate from that very long distance, because that's where he is most comfortable with his own strikes. But the problem is, and you're right, he does like to wrestle a lot with his own style. The problem is, he's all the way out or he's all the way in. There's not a lot of that mid-range game. And the thing about Valdez is, I think in the mid-range he will have more success. You are right. He does turn into a grappler himself. But I do think that for as long as this fight is on the feet, at least he seems more comfortable to be there. And maybe that is just his brawling tendency. So hey, you're going to look good sometimes. You're going to look bad sometimes when you are that chaotic kind of a striker that he is. But I do think for Valdez, it's going to be really interesting to see how he deals with the pressure of Levy. Because that's the one thing about Levy that does stand out. He does really make you feel his pace, even though he is a long-distance striker. I know that's a weird thing to say. You normally associate volume striking with a lot of pressure.
His volume's bad.
It is bad, though, and that's the thing. He's going to stay on the outside, though, really feint a lot from the outside to try to draw out your own attacks, and then he's going to shoot off of those. So, you're right, these are 2 really interesting fighters, and it is a tough code to crack for either guy.
Tough crow to crack.
Code to crack.
Matt, screw it. We'll do it live. Everybody that's tuning in.
You messed up as much as I have.
You guys get an FNP first. Toss a like if you're loving the content. But what I wrote down for this, going back and doing the tape study, again, I put neither man should be considered a huge grappler, but they love to grapple. For Valdez, it's power takedowns to then go submission or damage over position. And he will. He's one of those guys like AJ Dobson. AJ Dobson will take you down and then go for a rear naked choke with no hooks on the back, just from the side. Valdez is one of those guys. And when I look at Natan Levy, what I had written down was, Levy, it's continuing to chain all of his takedowns, and he's always threatening with them. And maybe he'll get a submission, maybe he won't, but he tired his last time out against Mike Breeden, who's like, came into the UFC on short notice, lost 2 fights, and he's still around. But for Levy, it really is kind of tricky. So Darren is saying, really testing the stamina with the live show. You're darn tootin', but these guys are really testing each other's stamina with their fight styles. Again, Levy's all the way out, not a ton of volume. He will land with a little bit of power, and he's got a lot of submission wins for what it's worth. That gives me a chance to get the graphics up. He's got 3 wins by submission, none by knockout. For Renato Valdez, 7 by knockout, 3 by submission, but a type of guy that's going to knock him out, drag him out. So when I was on vacation, last reference, we were sitting in the hotel room, and we needed like a day to cool off. We had a Knights game at night, and so I needed something to do, so I'm going to watch some fights. So I'm sitting there with my wife, and I said, hey, have you ever seen Matt Frivola versus Renato Valdez? And what was her answer? Of course, it was no. She was blown away. She loved it. I sat there and counted the knockdowns. I counted 5. The UFC counted 4. And I know Matt Frivola all of a sudden is Alex Pereira, and he's knocking guys dead, vaporizing them. But against Renato Valdez, the wrestler completely outstruck the striker in that one. And that was with Frivola hands by his chest, and Valdez landing the few of his shots. So again, I look at this fight. Levy, his pacing's kind of odd. He's low volume. He likes to go off the back foot. He's absolutely shredded. He tires as the fight goes on. Whereas Renato Valdez pushes a high pace from the start. So that's what makes this fight just a little bit weird. But Matt, we'll have a look at the odds on this one. Best fight odds. And we have a look. Valdez is the underdog. Open plus 140, plus 162. We look at Levy, open minus 160, minus 200 right now. We have a look at those darn Tapology votes. So it's going to be a surprise to us as it is to you. And I'm going to say over-under 70% Levy because he's a favorite.
I think it'll be over.
It's going to be over. Slightly over. 859 total votes, 75% Levy, 69% by decision, 12% by submission, 11% by knockout. For the 25% that have Valdez, 31% by decision, 57% by knockout. So Matt, what's your pick? Because from the comments, Boris, what's your top 3 bets? Boris found the wrong channel. Martin Rodriguez, Levy fought poorly against Mike Breeden. Dude was so gassed. MPTV, don't see Levy as a grappler, but maybe Craig knows something more. I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, so you say that, and I'm saying this. He's got 3 submission wins, and so far in the UFC for Natan Levy and on Dana White's Contender Series, he took down Shaheen Santan and submitted him. He had 3 takedown attempts against Rafael Garcia. He had 9 takedowns attempted and landed against his last opponent, Mike Breeden. So he's grappled in all 3 fights. He's more or less billed as a striker, and he likes to take guys down. That's what I've seen.
Yeah, I would agree with your breakdown of that. I don't think all that highly of Natan Levy, but I still think he's going to win this fight. I like his distance management, and I do think Valdez is going to be swinging at air a lot. I do think he's going to be the more aggressive fighter, and that's the thing. Valdez might win the first round. He might be a pretty good bet to win the first round, but I think as the fight progresses, which is weird to say with a guy like Levy, as the fight progresses, I think Levy is going to have more success with his own takedowns and his own grappling, because Valdez becomes a grappler once he does get a little bit more tired on the feet, when he's a little bit exhausted for swinging those big bombs. I think when he gets to that point of exhaustion, that's when Levy can start to take over with his own grappling. But the thing about Levy is, I think his style of grappling is going to have a very big difficulty against the higher level guys in this division. There's some great grapplers offensively and defensively in this division. Think of a guy like Renato Moicano, who's not even ranked at 155. Like, there's some great fighters in this division. I like Levy, but I'm just not really sure where he fits into the whole picture of 155.
I like him a little bit more. Like, Valdez didn't really beat the highest level competition. At one point, I thought the Arizmendi win was really good, and then Arizmendi went on to lose a whole bunch of fights, the guys that are now in the UFC. But Valdez is kind of an interesting case. I'm eager to see what we get out of him in this matchup. But for both of us, going with Levy, I think, again, the acumen as far as the striking defense, the fact that he can cut side to side against a guy who's more straight down the line. That's why I had Natan Levy. Nothing going on in this one, but both of us going with Israel's Levy, who's training out of Extreme Couture for this one. He's been at Syndicate for a bit, but this one at Extreme Couture. So, Matt, that brings us to Tracy Cortez versus Amanda Ribas. And some people saw the tweet that I threw out there. Amanda Ribas took the number 15 that Marina Moroz occupied for about a week. She was ranked when she was going to fight Jennifer Maia. Was not ranked on Sunday when I wrote my notes and we did the video. But for Ribas, she's now ranked 15th. And I took umbrage with it because her fight that she lost against Caitlin Chukagian was way back in May. So why not have her ranked at a certain point? Her win, her only win at flyweight in the UFC is over Paige Van Zandt in 2020. It was a first-round armbar win. But for Ribas, split decision loss to Caitlin Chukagian her last time out. And there were glimpses of success in that one. We'll talk about it as we move forward through this video. But Matt, she's taking on Tracy Cortez, undefeated in the UFC, lost her pro debut. She's won all of the fights since, and she's looked really good. And 2 of those fights in the UFC at 135 and 2 at flyweight. So a really interesting look there. Looks really good on Instagram too. Getting ready for this one, wearing the new fight kit, looking shredded.
But that is the big thing about this fight. They are kind of meeting in the middle at this weight class because for Ribas, she fought at 115 for a while in the UFC, and now they are meeting at 125. So I'll be curious to see if the physicality of Cortez is going to play a factor, because Cortez is the much more traditional grappler in this matchup, where she's going to go for a lot of single, double leg takedowns, a lot more of that kind of American style of wrestling, whereas Ribas likes those judo throws that are much more traditional in women's MMA.
Would you say that she's a black belt in jiu-jitsu and judo?
You definitely would.
She is.
But the thing about Ribas is, I don't know if she's going to be good enough on her back to submit a fighter like Tracy Cortez, because Cortez is really good on top, and she's a very dominant fighter in that position. And I know we talked at length about that in her fight against Stephanie Egger, and that win, in hindsight, looks pretty good, because Egger is a fighter who is very dangerous, especially from that position. So maybe, or not maybe, Ribas is definitely a better fighter on the feet than a person like Egger, but where Egger is most dangerous is a position that I think this fight's going to take place in a lot, because if Ribas isn't able to get Tracy Cortez's respect on the feet with a big power shot, and to Ribas's credit, she doesn't have pillows in her hands by any means. Like, when she hits, she does land with a decent amount of power. I just don't know if, like, it happens a lot in boxing. You have fighters moving up in weight classes and down in weight classes. Think about Canelo moving up to 175 to fight Dimitri Bivol.
Did not work.
But he had monster knockout power at 168. He had monster knockout power at 160. Yes, he looked good against Kovalev, but Kovalev was really old. My point is, in boxing, since people jump up and down in weight classes a lot more, you can kind of tell what the limit is of their power at a certain point. I'll be curious to see if, since Cortez is the bigger fighter, will that have an effect on her ability to absorb the punishment of Ribas?
Well, and MPTV makes my point. So this is the part about doing it live that just points get taken. But I'm super impressed with Cortez beating Gatto. That's where I was going to go with it. Gatto and Stephanie Egger. Do they initiate their own takedown? Not all the time, because they're so good off their back and they're sweeping for submissions. Gatto almost submitted Tracy Cortez, but couldn't get it done.
Exactly.
Stephanie Egger had no success against Tracy Cortez. Short notice fight though it was. But for Amanda Ribas, I mean, Vina Jandiroba wasn't able to submit her, and Vina's pretty darn good,
True.
although she knocked her down with that club. And Marina Rodriguez knocked her down in the second round of their fight, and Herb Dean thought about stopping
Is Vina as good of a natural wrestler, though, for MMA? Because here's the thing. I feel like my knee-jerk reaction is Tracy Cortez is a better wrestler. Vina has great MMA wrestling. Who would you give the edge to?
I'd give it to Tracy Cortez,
Yeah,
and she's bigger, so in this fight, I think Cortez wins out in that one. But then the other one that you can play for devil's advocate of a comparable, remember when Amanda Hebos fought Mackenzie Dern?
I do.
She looked really good in that fight, so that is kind of the fight
That was
you have to
Dern's
think
first
about.
fight off pregnancy, though, and that was the thing. It feels like a lot of fighters who, after they take a lot of time off, think about any athlete in any sport. They need one performance to kind of burn and get out of their mind before they can kind of continue on their path.
Pyramid Dream's all about it. Cortez for this one, big ups FNP for the live. Don't get used to it because so much talking, but when you do look at it, like these are some of the things that I had in my notes, so I really want to kind of hammer this one home. Both of them have positive strike differential, something that you don't see every day, but it's 3.4 strikes landed per minute for Cortez to 4.5 for Hebos. Those are just the UFC stats. So for Hebos, her strike differential is 1.89. It's pretty darn good there. She averages her own 2.19 takedowns per 15 minutes, 88% takedown defense, 70% strike defense. Now, she has been finished, Marina Rodriguez, and you saw that fight with Jungle Fights where her and now a surging Pauliana Viana just went at it. And Viana dropped her, and then she kind of got back up, and she dropped her back again. So when I look at this fight, obviously both can grapple. For Hebos, it's the head and arm throws, the judo, it's the jiu-jitsu. For Tracy Cortez, it's the takedown, then do a bit,
A lot of the wrestling.
and then hold her down. So you do look at it, 3:29:28 when she beat Melissa Gatto at UFC 274, but I had it again in my notes, control-oriented grappling, and that really is her thing. For Hebos, her last time out, MMA decisions, 2 scored at 30-27 Chukagian, 10 scored at 29-28 Chukagian, 2 scored at 29-28 for Hebos.
It's like every Chukagian fight.
And I had
the
it 30,
decision's going to be controversial.
I had it 30-27 Chukagian, but regardless, it is a really weird one because I don't see Cortez doesn't strike. Like Vina has odd power. I mean, remember the Kanako
awkward.
Murata fight? Weird. But if you look at it for Cortez, it's just boxing combinations to close the distance, to get the takedown, single, double, hold you down, threaten with position over submission or finish. For Hebos, it's a lot of strike, but the trouble that she has, and a lot of fighters do, is she starts to throw her arms and she brawls and sees red and leaves her head there, and she's susceptible to getting hit. So it's going to be interesting to see how this one plays out.
It will be. It's just... Does the UFC feel like they're done with... Are they out of the Amanda Hebos business? Like, is this them
It's weird that
casting...
this is a
cashing-
prelim.
But still, like, someone's going to get a push. And we know Hebos got the push off of Paige Van Zandt. Paige Van Zandt was a fighter that the UFC invested heavily in, and now she makes videos and content on the internet. But for Hebos, she kind of got the rub, if you will, from her, and then the torch was passed to her. And then she beat Mackenzie Dern, so it made her even more popular. Does the UFC now think, okay, Hebos, we've kind of seen what her limit is in the division. Tracy Cortez, you're right. Does her style sell a lot of tickets? Not necessarily, but if she gets a fight like Amanda Hebos on her resume, then maybe that is good enough to then get other ranked opponents, because normally in a division like this, you would favor a fighter who is more likely to get a stoppage win, and Hebos is definitely that fighter in this matchup. She has decent power on the feet, like we've said. She has good body kicks, too. I could see those playing a part, and she does have decent submissions off her back and on top. Now, I don't think those are going to play a big factor in this matchup. I just think Tracy Cortez, her style might not be all that appealing, but I still feel like her wrestling is going to be good enough to get her the win in this fight.
Well, look at the odds over on Best Fight Odds. Bear with us. Tracy Cortez opened at par. She's still at par. Hebos opened at par. Was a favorite for a bit, and she's still at par. We have a look at the Topology votes. Surprise to us as they are to you. Tracy Cortez, fan favorite. Amanda Hebos, also fan favorite. I'm going to say over under 62.5% Cortez.
I think it'll be under.
I think it's going to be under. Oh boy, look at that. 1,963 total votes, 52% Cortez, 87% by decision. For the 48% that have Hebos, 78% by decision. Going into that fight against Caitlin Chukagian, Hebos was a plus 150 underdog and won Fight of the Night honors against the number 1 ranked fighter in the division. Now she's fighting the what?
Very different styles, though.
13th ranked fighter, and Hebos herself is now ranked 15th. She's looking for her first win since 2020 in this division. She went 5-2 at because we're doing it live and you don't get the chance at hindsight. No, she went 5-1 down at strawweight. 4-1 at strawweight. See, we're doing it live. It's weird. For me, I do like all of those strengths of Amanda Hebos, and I'm going to pick her in this fight because I think she is the better striker. I do like the threat of the submission of her in this fight, but Matt, like you said, we've seen it against Gatto, we've seen it against Stephanie Egger, fighters who possess that X factor that Ribas has. Just for me, Ribas has a little bit more, of a more polished striking approach than somebody like Gatto, who's looked good in the UFC, and Egger as well. So I have Ribas.
I think the size of Tracy Cortez is going to pose a lot of issues for Ribas, because Ribas is not a big fighter for this weight division whatsoever. Like, I think she could go back down to 115 if she really had to for, desperate career choices, a la Dan Hooker going down to 145 to fight Arnold Allen again. But I find it hard to disagree with you on that matter. Since Ribas is the more well-rounded fighter, I do like her movement too, and I think her movement will give Cortez issues. I think if she can stay on the outside, really use her volume, and avoid crashing in. I know that's going to be a big issue for her, because when she does start to have success, she can kind of get a little overzealous and bite down on the mouthpiece a bit. If she does do that, then I could see Cortez getting on top of her, but I will agree with you. I do think Ribas, since she is the more well-rounded fighter with her striking advantage, is going to get the win.
Now we're to the point of the show where people disagree with the picks, and that's just what it's going to be. But MPTV and Christian, they're saying no Craig and come on Craig, but that's the way she goes. Both of us going with Amanda Ribas in this matchup. People are upset about it. We apologize. Matt, our next fight, we have Darren the Damage Elkins taking on Jonathan Pearce. So I'm going to open it up, and this is going to be the first reference of anything. For Darren Elkins, if he's going to have success, he's kind of got to be like the title track from St. Elmo's Fire. Look at me, I'm a man in motion. He's got to really bring it together. I mean, that was a movie with Emilio, the Mighty Ducks guy, and Rob Lowe. So how about that?
I'll even throw a basketball reference. To me, Darren Elkins is like Udonis Haslem. Like, I'll see him out there sometimes, and I gotta rub my eyes to make sure someone didn't put something in my drink.
Didn't he play like a minute one season and get kicked out of that game?
Udonis Haslem guarded Jason Tatum last night, and it was like elder abuse. Like, it should not have happened.
But when you do look at this fight, Matt, for Darren Elkins, if he's going to have success, that's my point. He's got to be a man of motion and continue to just bring that storm. And he was able to do it when he took on Minner. He was able to do it when he took on Tristan Connolly. It's just takedown, takedown, takedown. Oh, just outlast his opponent, and then he just breaks them. And for Jonathan Pearce, we saw that in his UFC debut. He had that happen to him against Joe Lozon. It was threat of the takedown, hold my hands low, boxing of Joe Lozon, and then he just couldn't figure it out. But boys, Pearce looked good in his last four fights. And I went back and rewatched, all of the fights. But the one that stuck out to me, his last fight against Makwan Amirkhani, and you look at it for Makwan, what's he good at? Wrestling and front chokes. What's Darren Elkins good at? Wrestling, but not front chokes, but wrestling. But if you look at it for Makwan, every time he went for the takedown, he'd get Pearce down for just a bit of a second, and then Pearce would scramble out of it, and he'd be in his own advantageous position. Or he'd leave his head out there, and Makwan would get the front choke. And then somehow JSP would just wizard his way out of it. So JSP, you have him, you have Tracy Cortez, and then you have a fighter in Eryk Anders later on this card. They're all at a Fight Ready MMA. For Pearce making that move to Fight Ready, he's looked like a much better fighter. His cardio's been a question at times, like in his fight against Christian Rodriguez and some of them as well. But if you look at it, the boxing's coming a little bit, the kicks are coming a little bit, but Pearce, very much, he was a high school wrestler, and he still wrestles a heck of a lot in his fights, and he's very good at it.
I think this is a really bad fight for Darren Elkins, Craig, I'm not going to lie. Darren Elkins at this stage of his career has eliminated a lot of his own striking from his own game plan. Now, even go back to the Alexander Volkanovski fight, and I think that's an oddly good fight for Darren Elkins. I know he gets dropped in every single round, but he does kind of hurt Volkanovski to the body with one of his odd, kind of switch kicks. It was a weird performance. It's not often that you can praise a guy for getting dominated in a fight, but still, when you consider the level of guy he was fighting in that fight, you can take some positives from it. But you're right, when you fight Darren Elkins, it really comes down to a test of how good is your cardio and how good is your not quit ability, because there are some people who will wilt under the pressure of a guy like Darren Elkins, but that really comes down to the fact that he's not striking a lot at this stage of his career, because I think he does realize that he cuts open so easily. Refs are going to stop the fight if they just see Darren Elkins leaking blood, because he's one of those guys who doesn't just get a little nick and then the cut man
he's recently released Nate Diaz.
Yeah, it gets really gruesome in there sometimes when Darren Elkins is fighting. And I just think his style of grappling is going to be difficult, because Pearce is a guy who will sometimes accept the momentum of your takedown to then try to get on top of you. He is a little crafty with some of his transitions on the mat, and I think those are going to be really key against a guy like Elkins. And with Elkins fighting in the way where he really weaponizes his pace and cardio, when is that going to run out? He is 38 years old, and he's taken a lot of damage. He's been in a lot of really difficult fights. I don't know how much longer he's really going to be able to go out there and weaponize his pace. It's a young man's game fighting like like that.
We're going to talk about this as we go on because this is the first of 3 legends fighting, and then you have a legend at the end of the card, and they all share similarities in the UFC's ranking books. But Darren Elkins is tied for 7th all-time in UFC history, regardless of weight class, with 11 decision wins. Number 1 is Neil Magny with 13, so 2 more for Elkins, and he's up there at the record. He's 10th all-time in control time at 1 hour, 52 minutes, and 45 seconds. That's 1 minute less of control time than Hall of Famer Matt Hughes, and he's also 6th all-time in total strikes landed at 2,339. Number 5 is RDA at 2,418. So Darren Elkins is in with very good company in the UFC's record books. He's one of those guys. Is he in the Hall of Fame?
No.
Is Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds going to get into the Hall of Fame? Off of that Hall of Fame, what is it? The contingent that's going to vote on that? We'll find out. But when you do look at this one, from 2015 to early 2018, Elkins went 6-0. Then his next 4 fights were Volkanovski, Lamas, Hall, and then Landwehr, and it kind of fell off. And then his last 4 fights, he beat Garagori, Minner, lost to Swanson, beat Connolly back in April, 3:30:27, 7 minutes and 52 seconds of control time to pad that number. And what I really liked out of Elkins in his fight against Connolly, you know, breaking a guy down, take him down, so on and so forth, because Connolly,
his own game,
155, 170, but Elkins, 55 total strikes in the first round. 40 total strikes in the second, 70 total strikes in the third round. So the cardio hasn't really fallen off, even with the age that he's at right now.
I still worry, though. Like, he's not getting any younger. I know none of us are, but at 38 years old, the cardio doesn't get any better. And I know it is a bit of a weakness for Jonathan Pearce, but that's only if he's fighting at a very high work rate. And that's the thing. If these guys are fighting at a high work rate, then they're probably grappling. And I do favor Jonathan Pearce to be the more damaging grappler between these two guys. You had mentioned it. Darren Elkins is a guy who's going to wrestle a lot, but he's not going to damage you with ground and pound. He's not going to go for a lot of submissions. He'll threaten with stuff just to get into a better position and be more dominant. But if this fight ends inside the distance, it's because Jonathan Pearce has landed some really good ground and pound, or he's got a rear naked choke or something along those lines. I just think Pearce is the much younger and the much more physically strong guy in this match.
Yeah, Pearce is really big for this weight class. And for Pearce, you talk about Elkins and how legendary he is with top control and his takedowns. But for Pearce in the UFC, fights Kai Kamaka, good wrestler, 5 takedowns. Fights Omar Morales, not necessarily a grappler, 6 takedowns. Takes on Christian Rodriguez, incredibly well-rounded, just got his first UFC win, 6 takedowns. And he got 4 against Makwan Amirkhani. Performance of the night, second round TKO. Dan Mulvahedi's finishing statement was, "I've seen enough," before he waved it off. So that's tricky. We have a look at the odds in this one. And for Jonathan Pearce, he's a, holy frig, open -300, -484.
I didn't look at the odds, but I gotta be honest, I'm not surprised.
Darren Elkins open +250, +357. We have a look at the Topology votes. Surprised odds they are to you. I'm going to say over-under 85% JSP then. Hot shot.
I think they'll be under 85, but they'll be way above 50.
I thought they were going to be over. 1,959 total votes, 91% Pearce, 21% by decision, 65% by knockout for the 9% that have Elkins, 52% by decision, 30% by knockout. I think JSP gets the win in this matchup. A like would be appreciated on this video. It definitely would. But if you look at it for a guy like JSP, the size advantage, I don't love the cardio, and I really do. I like the old man cardio out of Darren Elkins, so maybe he's able to tough out another win like he did against Connolly, like he did against Minner. But for me, I like the grappling of JSP, and I think a game plan from a guy like DeFranco and Eddie Cha is going to get you really ready for a matchup like this.
I couldn't agree more. Again, I kind of said it to lead. I think this is a really good matchup for JSP, and he has looked really good as of late, but I still can't get over his Darren Elkins Hall of Fame. Is Dwayne Dedman going to make the NBA Hall of Fame for playing 50 seasons?
Darren Elkins, I mean, he's 3-1 his last 4 fights. All right, we move on to our next one. So we talk about legends. Matt, we have Michael the Menace Johnson taking on Marc Diakiese, and if I told you about these two guys, I would say, well, first of all, you look at it for Michael Johnson, and he wrestled in community college, and he was a really good wrestler when he was in community college. And if you look at it career-wise, 79% takedown defense. Guys that had success with the takedowns in the UFC against Michael Johnson. I'm going to get his name right this time, Matt. Reza Madadi from All Stars MMA. You also had Miles Jury.
He was a tough out for anybody, Madadi.
Clay Guida and Habib all had takedown success against Michael Johnson. But apart from that, not a lot of guys have really found it against them. And if you do look at it, you know how quick his hands are. You know that he was on the Ultimate Fighter season GSP versus Koscheck, where he lost to Jonathan Brookins. But when you do look at it in this matchup, Matt, for Johnson, the talk was, well, he beat Artem Lobov in Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada, and then he didn't win a fight for a very long time. Took a long time off, came back, got a finish win, and looked great against Alain Patrick, and then his last time out, he lost a split decision to Jamie Mullarkey. But not all split decisions are created equal, because I had to go back and watch it in half speed to see how he knocked down Jamie Mullarkey in the second round. He lands a right hook that stuns him and then a left straight, and it drops Jamie Mullarkey. And I thought Michael Johnson won that fight 29-28. But if you look at it, Mullarkey gets the win, and Mullarkey looked great his last time out, so that one ages differently. But if you look at it for Diakiese, he comes into the UFC and he's all flash and flare. And now all of a sudden his last 2 fights with the takedowns, you look at it. Marc Diakiese, I bet this surprised a lot of people. His last 2 fights, he's landed 30 significant strikes and 19 takedowns. He's got 4 30-27s and 2 30-26s and 25 minutes and 59 seconds of control time.
Impressive.
How wild is that to see an absolute role reversal out of Marc Diakiese to become such a dominant wrestler his last 2 times out?
Quite frankly, it's insane. Like, you never would have predicted that based on his earlier performances. He was a guy who would throw, like, Zabit-level kicks. No, they weren't that great. That's the thing. Like, that's the cool thing about Marc Diakiese. He kind of figured out that what I'm doing, although flashy, although it might get me more fans, it's not that effective against the highest level of competition. And ever since he has been able to add his wrestling into his game plan, you're right, his strikes have gone down, but he throws effective strikes. I feel like the accuracy of them has gone up because he's added the threat of the takedown into his game. And where I zag a little bit, and maybe I'm not really zagging, you'd probably agree with me on this, Michael Johnson's hand speed is still good, but it's not what it once was whatsoever. Like, Michael Johnson reminds me a little bit of a Vitor Belfort. The difference is, Vitor, even after the TRT and, you know, his issues, Vitor still had fast hands and he was like 42 years old. That was his kind of X factor that never left. For Johnson, it is starting to fade. His hand speed...
I was really fast on Marc.
I know, but Jamie Mullarkey's a guy who gets hit in every single fight. Just because you're landing against a guy like Alain Patrick, that doesn't mean that much. And a guy like Jamie Mullarkey, who has been hit a lot and definitely struggles with his striking defense, does not have me completely sold that Michael Johnson is now the menace on the feet that he once was. Now, I will be very curious to see if this fight does stay on the feet and how both guys are going to look, because Diakiese does like to work a lot from kicking range. I know it's weird, he added elbows into his game, which was nice to see, but that's the thing about Diakiese. I do feel like he has managed to add things to his game. Is he a flawless fighter? Not at all. And you do worry when he fights kind of a straight up specialist in any one area. If you're a top tier wrestler, you're going to be able to take him down. If you are a top tier boxer, well, defensively, you're probably going to be able to cut through some of the flashiness of his striking style and really start to go to him. I just don't know if Michael Johnson is that fighter. If this was the Michael Johnson who beat Edson Barbosa all those years back, he mops the floor with Marc Diakiese, and this fight isn't close whatsoever. And I do think that's a fight that is very important because Edson Barbosa fights a lot like Marc Diakiese, or at least he once did. Now, I know, like you had mentioned, Diakiese is added in the wrestling. I just don't know what version of Michael Johnson we're going to get. I know he has looked good as of late, but again, I really feel like you have to judge him based on the level of competition. And Mullarkey, although he looked good his last time out, is a hittable fighter.
I agree with you on your points. The other zag to this one is, okay, let's look at it from Marc Diakiese, because everybody's talking about his wrestling. The commenters are talking about his wrestling as well. I can see you over there. I will acknowledge you, but if you look at it for Marc Diakiese, he tried to wrestle against Rafael Alves. He got submitted right off the hop. It was like watching Clay Guida fight against Claudio Poyes. Don't wrestle.
Michael Johnson's not a grappler.
He beat Slava Borshev and Damir Hadzovic. They don't wrestle at all. Their wrestling is the biggest weak point. Slava Borshev is a K1 kickboxer, and if you look at it for Damir Hadzovic, remember when he fought Call of Duty's Hanato Moicano, who's learned English on a video game and he's become
so funny.
He's the biggest guy in MMA right now. Hanato Moicano, so hot right now. But if you look at both of those guys, like that fight against Moicano was like, no, we weren't supposed to grapple. Let's fight now. Let's get the fight going on the feet. Diakiese, again, 25 minutes and 59 seconds of control time and 30 minutes of fight time in his last 2 fights. The thing for me is, career-wise, big enough sample size for both of these guys. For Diakiese, 7-5 in the UFC. For Michael Johnson, 12-14 against a good level of competition. You remember, Diakiese had a fight of the night when he took on Fiziev. He lost that fight, but it was a fight of the night. Strikes landed per minute. The difference between these two guys, Diakiese, 2.63 to 2.33, so it's positive. UFC average is 3.4, positive negative. So he is below average in both, but a good defensive metric. For Johnson, 4.2 to 3.91. So again, it's higher, but he gets hit a little bit more statistically that way. So we have a look at the odds in this matchup just to tell a little bit of the story. Diakiese is a big favorite, open minus 160, minus 330. We look at it for Johnson, open plus 140, plus 252. So the legends, the last 2 fights, are the underdogs. So we have a look at the Topology votes, Matt. Surprise to us, they are to you. I'm going to say over under 80% Marc Diakiese.
I think they'll be under.
Think they'll be under? Hold! 2,000 votes, 80%, 80% by decision for Diakiese. For the 20% that have Johnson, 36% by decision, 53% by knockout. We'll go over there to the comments section. We got evacuation point. Doubt it. It will just get 20 takedowns around for Diakiese. Craig really think Johnson looked good his last fight. Thinking he is the underdog pick of the card. Maybe Diakiese plays a part in his highlight reel. Matt, who do you have in this fight?
I think it's a really difficult fight to predict because, again, we know what Michael Johnson once was, and it is hard to get that image out of your mind because at his peak, he was one of the better fighters in this division, and, he was Justin Gaethje's introduction to the UFC.
And that was a fight of the year.
Exactly. That's one of the great fights of all time. If you've never seen that fight, because I guess it's been a little while by now, I highly recommend going back. My issue is with Michael Johnson, I just don't love where his hand power is. His power's been good the last few times out, but it's against guys who I don't think all that highly of. I can openly admit that. A Law Patrick was, 38 years old, and he hadn't had a win in multiple years.
Oh, he took a long time off.
Exactly. The Law Patrick win, if you're going to beat anybody in the UFC for Michael Johnson, it was going to be Patrick then. Maybe you were really impressed by his win over Jamie Mullarkey, and I don't
he lost that fight by split decision.
By his performance, I should say, in the Mullarkey fight. But we don't pick fights based on the odds, even though I don't like where the odds are for Diakiese. I just think on the feet, if you look back at the Joe Duffy fight, Joe Duffy fights in a similar manner, at least striking-wise, as a guy like Michael Johnson.
He hasn't looked the same in a long time either.
I know. Michael Johnson's well past his prime, too. My point is they are both boxing primary strikers who have to get on the inside to have a lot of success. So maybe Johnson can get on the inside, use his boxing, get really good volume numbers, but I think Diakiese is going to be able to use his footwork to get out of the corners of the cage and use his striking to his benefit. I know it hasn't been a part of his game that we've seen a lot as of late, but I think he will show a little bit more of it.
To me, I like the Michael Johnson. Again, the floor is lava in the majority of his fights, unless it's the Thiago Moises fight. But if you look at it for Johnson, floor is lava. He was looking good against Josh Emmett until he didn't anymore. If you look at it, MMA, go ahead.
No. I was supposed to say, I thought Marc Diakiese was completely done after his fight against Nasrat Haqparast. I'm kind of surprised he has been able to look as good as he has as of late. I'm really impressed with what he's shown in his last few fights.
All right. Well, again, for me, I did like Johnson his last time out. MMA decision, 16 scored at 29-28 Johnson, 3 29-28 Mullarkey, 1 29-27. But if you do look at it overall, I do like Michael Johnson in this one. The hand speed, to me, it's still there. I think he's going to be able to do enough damage because for Diakiese, he's looked really good his last 2 times out against strikers that don't grapple. And in this one, I think Johnson has enough defensive acumen to get moving. Christopher's over there in the chat, 200 watching and not enough likes. He'd like to see the likes. You can also hit up the super chat if you love the channel. It's a Thursday drop. We'll be there on Saturday. And then, of course, you have UFC 282 coming up. And a lot of people are disappointed. And Matt, they still had the posters up for Glover versus Prohashka at the arena.
Would have been a great fight.
We're split on the pick here. I get Johnson, you get Diakiese. I think it'll be a fun fight. Then we get into Clay Guida versus Scott Holtzman. Combined age, if you consider the months in this one, is 80 between these two guys. Matt, when I think of Scott Holtzman,
insane.
There's got to be a Canadian that's probably somewhere between 30 and 35 that has a poster of Scott Holtzman in his office or something. Because Holtzman played club hockey when he was at the University of Tennessee, which they have stats for it. I went to Hockey DB because I'm a big Hockey DB guy. And then I found Scott Holtzman, and he played a few games on a lower tier team. And so I click on it, and it's got all of his years and all of his stats. And then you click on the team, and there's only stats for Scott Holtzman. Why is that? I don't know. It's pretty weird. I don't put the one try I got in club rugby on my rugby rec. But when I think of Scott Holtzman, Matt, I think, man, this guy plays hockey and he likes hot sauce. And again, I feel like some guy out there probably has a poster of him, with his big knockout wins. His big win over Dun Hyun Ma. They're probably hot on that one.
I feel like you're a better hockey player than Scott Holtzman is really what the root of all this is.
In. Some people
what
ask
does that
me
have
if
to
it's
do
live.
with any of it? That's a weird thing that you always bring up. I'll be like, hey, the sky's blue, and you're like, oh, Scott Holtzman would beat you up. I think this is a weird fight.
My main point to it, the fact that if you do look at his stats, he had 104 penalty minutes in 20 games. That's kind of wild. That's a fight every game.
Exactly, and then 2 other penalties sprinkled in there.
Couple trippings.
The thing about Scott Holtzman is, it is weird, and I brought this up earlier. You don't judge a fighter by how old they are. You judge them by how many difficult fights they've been in. And if you judge this fight based on those parameters, Clay Guida's about 98 years old, and Scott Holtzman's still in his, probably 50s, if we're being honest. He's still pretty old.
Clay Guida has 37 more pro fights.
But Scott Holtzman has been in a lot of firefights himself, and that's the thing that I do want to point to. A lot of Clay Guida's fights are, I'm wrestling, you're wrestling, it goes to a decision, hey, we'll see what happens. Clay Guida, although advanced in age, and although you might think of him for some of the crazier fights he has had, I don't really feel like he's a guy who, okay, if you look at him the wrong way, he's just gonna fall down. Like, he does still have a certain level of durability in his career. I know he lost by submission to Claudio Puelles, but that's not like a question mark surrounding his chin by any means. I just think for Guida, you probably think he is the much older guy in this matchup, and although not wrong, Scott Holtzman is not in his prime whatsoever. The way I look at this fight is a little bit how I look at Ryan Bader versus Fedor. I had a friend ask me about that fight.
The rematch?
The way I look at that is, the first time they fought, Ryan Bader was in his prime, and Fedor was definitely past his prime. But now, I think there's a pretty good argument that Fedor is very far removed from his prime, but Ryan Bader's not in his prime anymore, right? So maybe it evens the scale a little bit, just because Ryan Bader is that much older. That's kind of the way I look at this fight. 5 years ago, Scott Holtzman was much more in his prime than Clay Guida was, but I feel like at this point in their careers, Holtzman's not as explosive as he once was, because we all know how good of a boxer he is on the feet. He has great power in his hands. The takedowns have always been an issue for him, but maybe 5 years ago, I think his strength would have really helped him with those takedown defenses, because you can tell, don't just let me tell you or look at the graphic, like, he does use his physical strength a lot to defend some of those takedown attempts, and I think, again, a few years ago, he might have been able to do that. I just think now he might get caught up in some of the chain wrestling of Clay Guida.
There's things that I like out of this fight, there's things that I don't, and I mentioned some of those numbers for Darren Elkins and omitted them for Michael Johnson, but if I go back and I look at a guy like Clay Guida, 5th all-time in UFC fights. He's tied there with Damian Maia. He's 10th all-time in bonuses, tied there with 10 of them in general, and he's 8th with fight time, 6 hours, 14 minutes, and 36 seconds inside of the UFC's octagon. And if you look at it for Holtzman, he was 28 when he made his pro debut.
And Clay Guida was the Michael Johnson for Anthony Pettis coming to the UFC. Like, that's how far back Clay Guida goes. Anthony Pettis
was supposed to get a title shot.
Has his own organization of fights, and Clay Guida's still in the UFC, okay? So, it is wild to think how long Clay Guida's been around for.
But for Holtzman, like, I have it here, and I have it also on the graphic, so I'll switch those for yous. Shield Systems is where he's trained. So he does train there, but Jim O as well, so Brian Barberena. We talk about it, the GOAT, John Salter, at trying to solve the riddle of Clay Guida, as well as Joe Selecki. They all train out of that gym. Salter's kind of like that guy. But if you do look at it for him, he does really train his takedown defense to Scott Holtzman. If you look at it in the UFC, it evaded him in his losses. His loss to Drew Dober, his loss to Josh Emmett, his loss to Nick Lentz. And then if you look at it against Benil Dariush, his chin evaded him in that fight. And then against Gamrot, it was just the varied attack and then the chin in the end. But for Scott Holtzman, you kind of touched on it, but not too much. But his boxing really does get it done. When he's having success, it's really at a distance. He's got a lot of power at the end of that length, and he really can beat a lot of the guys in this division, or a lot of the guys that he has so far, with that length, with that range, with that size.
He definitely can. I think on the feet, this is definitely Scott Holtzman's fight to lose. I think he does have a big advantage in the striking, because Clay Guida has been clipped before. Like, Jim Miller did it not that long ago.
Leonardo Santos was looking great against him until he got tired.
But Clay Guida, oh my goodness, cardio. Don't leave the house without it. The thing about Holtzman is, I don't think his cardio is going to fall off a cliff. I think he will struggle with some of the wrestling, but I still think on the feet, he is going to be a difference maker if he's able to land strikes, especially consistently, because we don't really know how good a 43-year-old Clay Guida is going to be able to react to some of those power shots of Scott Holtzman.
Matt, when we do have a look at this one, we'll bring up the odds. Let's see where they're at. Holtzman, slight favorite, open minus 205, minus 175 right now. Guida open plus 175, plus 143. We have a look at the Topology votes. Surprise to us, they are to you. I'm going to assume people are going with Holtzman because he's the favorite. I'm going to say over under 72.5% Holtzman.
I think it'll be over.
I think it's going to be over. It's under. 1,957 total votes, 59% Guida, 77% by decision for the 41% that have Holtzman, 72% by decision, and 16% by knockout. So, again, those going with Scott Holtzman, they like the Dun Hyun Ma fight. They like the Jim Miller fight of the night where he lost the first round, but won round 2 and round 3.
That's what I'm about to bring up.
Is that what you like out of him?
It is, because that's the thing. Think about Jim Miller. I know him and Clay Guida had a crazy 30-second fight. It was absolutely... They both crack each other basically at the exact same time, and then Jim Miller cranks him with the guillotine. But Scott Holtzman beat Jim Miller by defending a lot of takedowns and beating him up on the feet. And the thing about Holtzman is, he doesn't have the cardio of a a traditional power puncher. He isn't somebody who I would say gets exponentially stronger as the fight goes on, but he does keep a solid pace. The thing about Guida is, if he's not having success with his takedowns, I do think Holtzman, like I said earlier, is the much better fighter on the feet. Again, for Guida, he can crack, but if he wants to hurt Scott Holtzman, he's going to have to put everything into an overhand shot, and that's going to leave him very vulnerable if he's not able to land that shot. On the flip side, Holtzman could probably keep this fight at range, land his jab, land his straight right, kind of switch stances. He has good elbows on the inside too, and again, you bring it up. Is he going to struggle against those top-tier power punchers like a guy like Beneil Dariush? Of course he is. But guess what? Most guys in the UFC are going to struggle striking against a guy like Beneil Dariush. Oh my god, that spinning back fist was filthy though. But I do like Scott Holtzman ever so slightly in this fight. But like I said, 5 years ago, I would really like Holtzman in this one. Now, I do think he is removed from his prime as well, but I like the Jim Miller win.
I'm eager. I want to see both of them stand off toe-to-toe on Friday. Want to see them both at weigh-ins because Holtzman, although he has 2 inches of reach and less an inch 1 inch less in reach, 2 inches in height, we're doing it live, I do think Holtzman will be able to get the win here. I mean, Clay Guida, it's like, okay, you're taking on Claudio Poyas, don't wrestle. What does he do? He wrestles him. You're taking on Jim Miller. Maybe you wrestle. Maybe you have success like Joe Selecki did, teammate of Scott Holtzman. What does he do? He brawls, and then he wrestles, and then he ends up getting finished. So for Guida, it just matters on what the game plan is going to be, because I would assume a team alpha male fighter like himself, he's going to go in there and wrestle against a guy like Scott Holtzman, who's shown that to be a problem. I mean, Holtzman against Josh Emmett. We never see Josh Emmett wrestle, and Emmett had tons of success in the wrestling in that fight. So I wouldn't be surprised if the underdog and Clay Guida got the win in this matchup. I'm going to go with Scott Holtzman. I think the hands are the difference maker, but I'm really looking forward to this fight between a couple of guys, again, combined age of 80.
You never know when it's going to be the last time when you watch Clay Guida fight. He's been in some memorable ones. Like, I always love watching Clay Guida fight, but I do like Scott Holtzman to get the win.
I hope it's not the last one. Matt, Angela Hill taking on Emily Ducote, and we look at this fight for Emily. I mean, she fought back in 2017 in a rematch, because she fought in 2016 against Alima Lane McFarland. Lost the first one by decision, lost the second one by submission, wasn't able to capture that flyweight belt over with Bellator. So then she kind of has some more fight. She loses. She ends up in Invicta. She beats 2 former UFC fighters. She wins the Invicta belt. And then she comes into the UFC and faces off against Angela Hill's main training partner, and Jessica Penne, and looked great. Looked just like Emily Ducote should, and did everything that she does in her fights, and she won that fight handily. So she looked really good in that one against Jessica Penne, but the difference is, for Penne, it's the really weird, sneaky takedown attempts and the weird longness of her game. Even though she's the former Invicta atomweight champ, she really does utilize her grappling very well in this division. And if you look at it for Hill, also a former Invicta strawweight champ way back when, but if you do look at it for her, it really is her Muay Thai in her game that gets it done. So somebody like Hill, with the kicks, with the variety of attacks that she has, could pose a big problem for Ducote, who has really good boxing training out of American Top Team Oklahoma City, and she has great leg kicks, as Emily Ducote, in her fights.
And she's also the more likely to go for a takedown in this matchup, I would say. I know Angela Hill has shown some wrestling in her back pocket throughout some of her career, but Emily Ducote is very much a wrestle boxer, even though a lot of her highlights, you think of her just being on the feet, but she is not a zero on the mat whatsoever. She does have effective grappling, and I definitely think she is the more likely, like I said, to go for a takedown between these two. But Angela Hill is always a very interesting test for any fighter. It feels like every time we break down an Angela Hill fight, it's, hey, she's fighting an up-and-coming prospect. How are they going to look against a rangy volume striker? And you kind of look at her record. She's going to win some of those fights. She's going to lose some of those fights. But in recent years, I feel like her volume has started to taper off, and she isn't necessarily the crazy volume puncher she once was. Now, against Ducote, it really does come down to how is Ducote going to deal with the range and the volume. I think she's going to be able to counter it effectively from the outside. I really do. Now, again, with Hill, it always comes down to, can her volume do enough to get to the judges' scorecards at the end of it? And maybe she'll kind of get the Maria Moreau's factor, where it's, hey, are they landing? Maybe, but she's doing something at least. She could have that factor. I just think Emily Ducote's a high enough level fighter to, when she notices Angela Hill throwing a lot of strikes, crash that distance, use her clinch, and when she isn't throwing a lot of strikes, she'll be able to work behind her own jab.
Now, I disagree with you a bit, and here's the reasons being. I mean, for Angela Hill, you look at it and you say the volume can taper, but 2 examples. The fight against Amanda Lemos, where she loses it, but she gets dropped in the first round. Isn't in a 10-8. Round 2, round 3, she takes over. Lemos tires. And then if you look at it for Hill, her last time out against Lupe Godinez, Hill's like a 3-1 underdog in that fight. Loses the first round, and then rallies in round 2, rallies in round 3. I thought Godinez won the fight, but regardless, Hill gets the win on her record. So it's another opportunity where she gets to turn away a prospect. For somebody like Lupita Godinez, it's always crashing forward, always boxing, mixing in her wrestling. But once Godinez couldn't get the takedown anymore, she did struggle. For Ducote, though, it really is, again, high guard, a lot of boxing combinations, but the thing that I like out of her is she'll throw that right as a bit of a check to the body to try and get you thinking. She'll throw a left hook there, and then again, like I said, the leg kicks, 116 out of 205 in her significant strikes against Jessica Penne. 51 of them were leg kicks, and she defended 8 of the takedowns. She became a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt before that Penne fight. And do I think Ducote's better at Jiu-Jitsu than Jessica Penne? I wouldn't be here to say that, but to have the takedown defense, to throw almost half of your strikes to be leg kicks, it's a huge part of your game to slowing down your opponent. And Angela Hill is a very movement-based fighter with a lot of her volume.
And I think Godinez is a lot more predictable, especially on the feet, than a fighter like Ducote, and that's why Hill was able to have success as that fight went on. I think Ducote from the outside is going to be able to manage at least the distance and some of those strikes that Hill employs into the cage. I'll be interested to see, though, if Hill goes for a lot of front kicks. Remember when Tony Ferguson was in his prime, throwing a lot of those front kicks, keeping his opponent at bay so they weren't going for takedowns, and then being able to set up his own shots. If Hill was able to use a game plan like that, I could see her having some success, but I do think the well-roundedness of Emily Ducote is going to be a big factor in this matchup, and I do think she'll get past the classic Angela Hill skill check that every single prospect has to go through.
I think it's going to be a really, really close fight. It's going to be one where you're kind of on the edge of your seat. For Ducote, she opened -120, -124. For Hill, open +100. +102. We have a look at those handy-dandy Tapology votes. And I clicked out of it, but we're doing it live. So we have a look. It's Hill versus Ducote, fight number 8 on the slate. I'm going to say over under 70% for Gordinha.
I think they'll be over.
I think they're going to be over. 61% out of 1,926 total votes going with Ducote. 87% by decision for the 39% that have Hill. 88% by decision. So a lot of people going with decision. Cool Banana Boy saying Hill isn't great, but she's very consistent. She'll get this one, and she very well could too.
She could, but again, I like Ducote in this one.
I like Ducote with the steadiness. The leg kicks I think are going to be a big factor, but if Angela Hill wins this fight, you talked about it. Teep kicks, front kicks, and her clinch game. Her clinch game's huge. Ducote likes to clinch to kind of take a second to then either go for a takedown or disengage and throw her boxing combinations again. Whereas Hill uses it offensively, and she has a really good job at getting that plum clinch and kind of wrenching away and then landing her own damage. So watch out for Angela Hill in this matchup, but both of us going with Gordinha. Emily Ducote, Matt, our next fight. We have Niko Price taking on Phil Rowe. A possible fight of the night opportunity at 170 pounds. And for Niko Price, Matt, this guy's had a really long UFC career. Maybe you don't think of it that way, but 7-5 with 2 no contests. His no contest, he beat Alex Morono by TKO. It's a no contest due to cannabis. He beat Cowboy Cerrone by majority decision. It's a no contest because cannabis. So 2 no contests.
If you had 14 kids, you probably would too.
4 no or 2 no contests for that. But for Niko Price, again, 7-5 in the UFC. And since he came into the UFC in 2016, for Price, he's kind of been that guy, like that gut check in the top 20 the whole time. The whole time he's been in the UFC, he's been fighting kind of those guys.
There's skill checks for pretty much everything in the UFC. At some point, you have to fight a dominant wrestler. At some point, you have to fight somebody who uses a lot of leg kicks. Niko Price is that guy you have to fight when you have to get into a brawl, because he is going to defend your takedowns well enough. He's not a great wrestler by any means, but he is tricky off of his back. We've all seen it many times. His knockout over Randy Brown, how crazy that is off his back. But since he's not a zero on the map by any means, I do think Niko Price is that very difficult test for any fighter making their way up the rankings. Hell, Vicente Luque had to do it 2 times. The UFC likes him so much as that gatekeeper. I just think for Price, though, and I mentioned this for Marcelo Rojo earlier on in the card, how much does he have left in the tank? We all know those people out there who burn that candle from both ends, and Niko Price's fight style burns that candle from both ends. Think about the amount of damage he's taken just from those 2 Vicente Luque fights alone. Those are 2 of the crazier fights you will ever go back and watch. I just always worry about that with Niko Price. To his credit, though, it did feel like he was taking a lot of fights just back to back to back to back, and it has been a little while since we've seen him in the cage, so maybe that has given him time to really rest his body. We will get just a better version of Niko Price this week.
Last fight for Niko Price was back October of last year, so a long time to recoup, regroup, and get ready for this one, and he's a fighter based out of Florida, so homecoming type of fight for Niko Price. For Phil Rowe, could also be considered that way because he trains out of Fusion XL in the Orlando area. He's originally out of New York, and if you do look at it for Phil Rowe, so interesting. Like, he's going to have, and I'll bring it up right there, he's going to have a little bit of a height advantage, but a massive reach advantage over most of the guys. I mean, 4 inches of reach in this fight, 3 inches of height. But he's one of those guys that when it starts to flow, it gets really good. He can get taken down by wrestlers. You saw that. Orion Cosey, Jason Witt had a lot of success at the start. And they both got finished. And in his fight against Gabe Green, he got dropped twice. In the second round, he got dropped in the third round. So for Rowe, again, it's just bringing it all together. Did he struggle a little bit against Shabazian? Sure. Then he finished him on Dana White's Contender Series. So Rowe is a really, really interesting type of guy. MPTV in the comments saying, would it surprise anyone if Phil Rowe won? No. So that's sort of why I'm picking him. Like, he is a really tricky fighter, and I have this written, like, for Niko Price, first 8 fights were from a promotion you'd expect Niko Price to fight for and win with.
Buffalo Wild Wings?
All with fight time. Fight time!
Yeah.
It's time. Like, Volkan Oezdemir probably ran that. But for Phil Rowe, again, I have it like, wrestle boxers beware, because if you fight him, eventually the tide's just going to turn, and it's Phil Rowe's day.
The problem is, though, Niko Price crashes into every striking engagement he has ever been involved in his life. He's not someone who strikes a lot from the pocket, which is weird. A lot of fighters stay on the outside, work their way into the pocket, and then get a lot of the work done. Niko Price is kind of the counter to that. It's, hey, I have great power on the outside, and that's the thing. Think about Amanda Nunes and how she hits fighters at the extent of her punching power. She's not hitting fighters when they're really close to her. She's utilizing all of her reach, and Niko Price is cut from that cloth. I know you brought up some of the statistics of Phil Rowe and how big of a fighter he is for the weight division, but I don't think Niko Price is going to struggle with that whatsoever. He's a guy who is going to use his kicks a lot. He's going to use his very long, straight punches, so oddly enough, Niko Price, I think, is going to fight much bigger than he is, because he always does, so I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch out for. My issue is, Price is going to throw kind of those 2 long, prodding front kicks, and then jump into boxing with 2 really kind of wonky shots. Yes, they are damaging if they land, but I think at a certain point, your unorthodox kind of comes back to bite you. You know, like, you can be that weird wonky fighter, but when there's enough tape out there on you, people are going to figure you out. And it's not that Phil Rowe does anything all that flashy. He really is kind of a meat and potatoes fighter. He doesn't throw, you know, crazy spin kicks like Isaiah Rodriguez, but I do think kind of the basics of his game and of his boxing are really going to be difficult for Niko Price to deal with. Now, could Price land one of those weird, awkward, off-angled shots from basically anywhere in the cage? Yes, and that's what is always going to make him a very dangerous fighter. Even when he's 41 years old, if he's still in the UFC at that point, he's going to be in these action type of brawls. But for me, I look at Niko Price as a guy who's going to go on to fight, you know, a Max Griffin, a Tim Means maybe. I look at Phil Rowe as a guy who, if he's able to get past Niko Price, maybe they give him Vicente Luque coming off a loss to Jeff Neal. Maybe they give him a borderline ranked fighter, or at least somebody on that top 20 scale like you would mention Niko Price being in. I just feel like for Rowe, there's tremendous upside in this pick, whereas for Price, we kind of know what we're going to get.
Yeah, it really is a weird one when it does come down to it. And in the comments section, we have Price as a brawler, but it's a toss-up. Rowe's significant reach advantage is a factor too, but sometimes he doesn't really use it, so it all depends. And then we also have, I believe, experience will prove helpful
and that's a good point.
Price. So if we have a look at the odds in the matchup, Niko Price, a slight favorite here, open minus 135, minus 141. Phil Rowe, open plus 115. And then he was a favorite. Now he's a plus 115 again. We have a look over on Topology, and this is where I think it's going to get spicy. Votes are surprised us, ARDU. I'm going to say over under 65% Niko Price, because I don't know where it's going to be.
I think they'll be under. I think they'll be close to 50.
Yeah, so 1,916 total votes, 54% Price, 47% by decision, 41% by knockout. For the 46% that have Rowe, 25% by decision, 65% by knockout. I think that if Phil Rowe wins this fight, it's going to be by submission. I don't think he's going to knock out Niko Price. Even though Price is there to get hit, if you look at it for Phil Rowe, I mean, like, yeah, again, you think about Randy Brown. He got into the grappling, and Niko Price had his day.
It was so weird.
But if you look at it for Phil Rowe, I think Rowe is that kind of guy that can get it done if it does get down to the mat. But I do have a hard time on this pick, like a lot of people are saying.
Exactly. Niko Price fights are always going to be very difficult fights. You're not going to just beat Niko Price in the first round and just get out of the fight. Like, he's going to make it
all over.
It's going to be bonus worthy every time you're in there with Niko Price, and that's why I think this is a good test for Phil Rowe. If he's able to beat someone like Niko Price, let's say he does get a submission or a TKO in like the third round or late in the second round, we're going to learn a lot about Phil Rowe moving forward forward, maybe we will think he is justified to fight some of those ranked fighters or borderline ranked fighters. I do like Rowe in this matchup, though, and I think this is going to be a great fight. I really do.
Todd's hanging out in the comments section. Ian Campbell and Hype MMA. Appreciate everybody for joining us so far. So your pick here is Phil Rowe?
It is. Even though I really like watching Niko Price fight, I'd watch him fight a box full of pool noodles. I just think the exciting factor of him is going to come back to bite him, and I like Phil Rowe for that reason.
I'm going to take Rowe ever so slightly, but guys, I'm really on the fence. Like I said, I have a really hard time with this one. Rowe, I don't necessarily think his style is conducive to getting wins against pressure fighters. We saw Gabe Green fight in a style that's somewhat similar to Niko Price, where he just threw a lot of volume, started to add power to his shots. And then once you get Phil Rowe backed up, well, that reach advantage is gone. And Rowe likes to back up and wait and wait and wait. And then you're behind the black line. And then you're up against the cage. And then you're either getting taken down or hammered on it at a certain point. So Price has a definite method to win in this fight. I think Rowe's got the power. And I like his jiu-jitsu. But I do have a hard time on this one.
It's a really fun fight, though. Like, I can't stress that enough. This could be an awesome.
Todd saying, brush up on the like, why don't you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Shout out to both these guys, though. Like you had mentioned, they're both in Orlando. And they did a shoe drive for kids today. And that's cool. Normally, MMA is just full of mean people saying mean things to each other, but for a difference,
I think the world's about that right now.
Yeah, but for Niko Price and Phil Rowe, like, that's the thing. These guys have no animosity. Like, we're as excited for this fight as any other on the card, and these guys were, like, chumming it up today, doing it for a good cause. So just shout out to these guys, because MMA can be a place where, like, it's all negative, but Niko Price and Phil Rowe aren't those negative kind of guys.
All right, Matt, next fight, we have the third of three fighters representing Fight Ready MMA. It's Eryk Anders. He's taking on Kyle Daukaus. And for Daukaus, like, I went through and I saw there was an interview out there a week or two ago, and it was actually 3 weeks ago. So then I went back and I watched it. And he did an interview with JHK in the All-Star MMA, and he kind of touched on a few different points. And the main ones being the magnitude of the losses and the difficulty of social media. You think in MMA, social media, the most negative place. But he also said, and this is the quote, I have to really focus in and really showcase my striking in this matchup because he knows that Anders is one of those guys that's going to crash the distance. He is forever an athlete, just like Dominic Reyes. The guy's an athlete. Worry. And I mean, roll tide. We know everything about Eryk Anders, but for Kyle Daukaus, you know exactly what he's about. I mean, it's going to be the grappling. And he struggled to grapple in some of his UFC fights. The Phil Haas fight, he was held down quite a bit. Haas had the advantage. The fight against Brendan Allen, rallied in the third round, but struggled with the physicality and the grappling. But then on the flip side, look at Kyle Daukaus' wins. I mean, Jamie Pickett, he became the Darth Knight. Then the nickname left after the Dolidze loss. And the Dustin Stoisfus fight, that was a Kyle Daukaus show. So he really accentuated and excelled in his grappling, his wrestling, and his overall mat ability in those fights. Now you're taking on Eryk Anders, a guy who, yeah, he's main evented against Lyoto Machida. He had that big fight against Thiago Santos. He's had some zigs and some zags. But for Eryk Anders, I mean, think about it. 2 fights ago, and I know this is a big name now in the division, but he's taking on a guy in Andrea Muniz, and they're striking, and then all of a sudden, Muniz goes for a power double leg, picks him up, and drops him. And then Anders gets back up to his feet, and Muniz just wiggle-woggles on his back, threatens to choke, and then all of a sudden, he's grabbing his arm and his leg, and they're in the same place. My sock's dirty. And he gets him in an armbar. Like, it was the craziest submission ever, but it's not outside of the realm to think that Kyle Daukaus can have success in this fight against a guy like Anders.
When Eryk Anders goes home for the holidays, he's like, Mom, can you check to make sure Andrea Muniz isn't under the bed? No, Eryk, he isn't. You just see Andre. This is a weird fight because Eryk Anders, we kind of mentioned it. There's all these different tests that you face when you're working your way up as a contender. You face people who rely a lot on leg kicks. You see how you deal with those guys who are really good wrestlers. Eryk Anders is, and I hate to use this term because it's been thrown around a lot, but I hope you agree with me. He's kind of that weight bully test. Like, Eryk Anders is as big as you can humanly be for this weight class. He really is. I remember the stat came out, and shout out to Elias Theodoro. When he had fought Eryk Anders, the stat came out that Eryk Anders weighed 220 pounds the night of the fight. That fight was contested at middleweight, so he gained almost 40 pounds. The thing about Anders is, every time you fight him at 185, it really does come down to how do you deal with that. And I think it's interesting when you ask that question, facing a guy like Kyle Daukaus, because if he beat Roman Dolidze, we would know exactly what that answer is. We'd say, hey, he'd be able to go out there, really be able to implement his wrestling. His size doesn't matter as much as his technique does, because his technique is so great that it can overcome physical advantages. We don't know that about Kyle Daukaus, though, based on that fight, and that is the thing. If he did look good against Dolidze, I think, of course, that is a great precursor to how he would look against a guy like Eryk Anders. Of course, Dolidze is more technical than Eryk Anders, but physically they're pretty similar. Like, they're both huge for the weight class.
We'll talk about Roman in the next fight, but he used to be a light heavyweight champ with WWFC.
Exactly.
He's talked about playing both weight classes, like Jalton Almeida with light heavyweight and heavyweight.
I just think for Daukaus, it is interesting, and maybe people are going to disagree with me. That's where the chat comes in handy. I feel like I think less of both of these fighters than the majority of people do. And I looked at the odds for
You've
this
been high on both these guys at some points, too.
I definitely have been, but yesterday was history, tomorrow's a mystery, and I think Eryk Anders has shown his true colors. Yes, he has improved somewhat in the UFC, but I've always given him credit for being a much better grappler than the average person probably would. You do forget, he used to do a lot of those no-gi jiu-jitsu tournaments.
He still does.
He still does, but it was a huge part of his game that I felt like was going unnoticed. If these guys grapple for 30 seconds, I think Kyle Daukaus is going to have a lot of success. I just wonder how much success Daukaus is going to have with his wrestling, because Eryk Anders, like I said, is physically huge for the weight class, and he does have decent takedown defense against guys who don't have that super high level background. So I think for Daukaus, maybe he has taken that level up, like you said, like he's eager to show in his striking. I just think it's going to be really interesting. Daukaus has an advantage with his grappling. It's just how does he get the fight there?
Well, and Daukaus kind of touched on it in the JHK interview, so go watch that with the All-Star, but he touches on it like, hey, I'd like the fight to go like the Muniz fight, but if it doesn't, maybe I'll showcase my striking. For Anders, fight ready, we've seen little added wrinkles in some of his game, and you see it out of Anders, like his last time out. I mean, the rug kind of got pulled out from under him. He thought he won that fight. He went 3 for 24 on takedown attempts. He got outstruck 105 to 65. MMA decisions, 9 had it 29-28 Anders, 2 had it 29-28 for Park. Park ends up getting the win, but if you do look at it for Anders, go back 3 fights ago, I guess. So last fight was Park. It's really close. You're splitting hairs. He loses that fight. Muniz, well, there's no question. He lost that fight. Before that, Darren Stewart in the rematch. And boy, did he look good against Darren Stewart. That was the loser leaves town fight, the Ric Flair versus Mr. Perfect in Raw in 1993. And Anders looked really good. So it does really depend on the striking in a fight like this. And it is odd. I mean, for Daukaus, give him the pat on the back. I mean, he's undefeated coming into the UFC, CFFC champ. It's not like everything was roses when he was an amateur. He's 5-5 as an amateur. So like a guy like Yorgan de Castro had a record like that. And then he beat Junior Dos Santos in real life. That happened.
That was a weird fight.
If you do look at it like this, yeah, I didn't see that Dolidze fight coming for Kyle Daukaus, because Dolidze in his last 2 fights has just gone, well, I'm going to fight Phil Haas.
Do you agree? Like, if Dolidze choked out, if Daukaus choked out Dolidze, no question in my mind he would beat Eryk Anders.
Yeah, like, there really are just a lot of things to kind of think about in this fight. So, when you do look at it from the perspective of the odds, we'll bring them up. I think I just clicked on the wrong thing. We're live. Eryk Anders, open plus 190, plus 180. Kyle Daukaus, open plus 225, still about there. We have a look at the voice crack. We have a look at the Tapology votes. Surprise to us, they are to you. If Daukaus is that big of a favorite, I assume that the voters are going to go that way. I'm going to say over under 77.5% Kyle Daukaus.
I think it'll be under.
I think it's going to be under. It's slightly over. 2001 total votes, 81% Daukaus, 44% by decision, 44% by submission. For the 19% that have Anders, 51% by decision, 37% by knockout. Michael is hanging out over there in the chat.
Baker, wow.
First, last. We got a lot of people hanging out over in the chat over there. Not enough likes so far. They would be appreciated. But Matt, when it does come down to this one, you're having a hard time picking it. I think I am.
I am having a hard time picking it because I don't like the odds on where they are with Daukaus. But what I will say is I hate the volume Eryk Anders has in the UFC.
Yeah.
Like, I joke around with one of my friends about Biggie Boy in the heavyweight division, how he's the most dangerous fighter in the world if he just moved forward and threw strikes. The problem is he doesn't do that at all. Eryk Anders is cut from a very similar cloth. He doesn't throw as much as you'd like. The numbers might be okay.
No, we'll just bring up the numbers just for the conversation's sake. 3.26 strikes landed per minute for Anders against 4.20 strikes absorbed per minute for Daukaus. It's 3.05 to 2.56. So a little bit more for output, but he gets hit a lot of it more.
And he loads up on everything. Like, Eryk Anders, I don't care what the stats are. He is not a good volume striker whatsoever on the feet. He doesn't set up his power strikes. There's a lot of winging at air. I think Kyle Daukaus is the more well-rounded guy in this matchup. Unless he is eating big shots on the outside, which we haven't seen from Eryk Anders in a meaningful period of time, if that's fair to say. Like, Eryk Anders hasn't demonstrated the power that he once did, especially as of late. So, ever so slightly, I'll like Kyle Daukaus in this matchup. But again, I feel like overall I am low on both these fighters based on the opinion that I once had.
Justin Pitnick really wants to hear about Kyle Daukaus, so the quotable from his Instagram video is all right, so I just wanted to come on and give everybody an update as to let you know what's going on with my face and stuff, why it's so swollen and everything. So yeah, during the fight I got kneed, obviously. As soon as the knee landed, it kind of broke my face in 3 places. The scans I got, I had 2 orbital fractures, and I think I had a fracture in my eye socket as well underneath. That is on an MMA Junkie video. I do like Eryk Anders in this fight. I don't see him getting submitted by Kyle Daukaus. That's just the big thing. Now, could he leave himself out there to be susceptible to getting submitted? Oh, he's shown that in the UFC. But I do like his striking a little bit more. The other weird thing about this is one of a couple of fights where it's billed as, and I forgot the graphics in this one, but it's billed as Southpaw versus Southpaw. So I'm interested to see how both fighters are able to go with that test. I think Anders has a little bit more of an advantage when it does come to the feet, even though Daukaus wants to accentuate his. Look at his 9 submission wins. And out of the losses, you see it like 1-3 with a no contest in the last 5 for Anders and 2-2 with a no contest for Daukaus. But remember how good he looked against Kevin Holland.
He headbutted him, he did.
There was a headbutt, and then there was that. So, Matt, we're split on the pick in this one. You have Daukaus, I have Anders. We will move on to the next fight, and we have a few left. Jack Hermansson's taking on Roman Dolidze. And originally, this was supposed to be Derek Brunson versus Jack Hermansson on November 22nd. Coming across the wire, Brett Okamoto with the news that it would be Dolidze taking the fight on short notice. So that's going to be an interesting one for Dolidze, especially taking on a guy in Jack Hermansson who does a lot of his work from distance, whereas for Dolidze, when he has success, he crashes that distance, comes forward.
I feel like Roman Dolidze is very hot right now in the MMA world's mind, but we can't forget where Jack Hermansson once was in the division. Like, he is one of the better offensive grapplers that we have seen. He goes for unorthodox submissions against high levels of competition, too, and that's the big difference between these guys. I've seen Jack Hermansson submit some of the best, or not some of the best, but some of the better grapplers in the division. Even a guy like David Branch. I know you might snicker at that right now, but David Branch was a very high-level grappler, and Jack Hermansson hit him with that weird inverted guillotine he was hitting everybody with for about a year and a half. It was just a really high-level submission win for Jack Hermansson that gave you a lot of confidence in his grappling against other guys at the top level. And think about the Kelvin Gastelum win, too. That's another great example of not only beating a guy, but beating a good grappler, too.
And he did it really quickly, and it was odd how quick it ended up going. But for Hermansson, the one I go back to is, like, if we're playing, it's not Plinko, it's the Yodel game there on Price is Right, but we're going all the way up. The fight that he had against Jauregui Souza, like, he looked really good in that one, and Souza wasn't necessarily out of it just yet. But for Hermansson, we talk about the good, and then the bottom falls out. He was chopped liver going into his fight against Chris Curtis, and everybody wrote him off.
They definitely did, because he doesn't react well to strikes in the feet whatsoever. He still doesn't. My opinion on that hasn't changed. Now, did he look better in his fight against Chris Curtis? Definitely. That was an awful fight, though. That was a great fight.
Again, I opened this video up saying Hermansson has a lot of success when he's at distance and striking. He landed a lot of leg kicks in that fight against Chris Curtis and didn't really get too much of his boxing going. And Curtis definitely wasn't going to go in there and try and wrestle. Now, he is the main training partner of Roman Dolidze, so maybe they can exchange notes a little bit out of the experience that Chris Curtis had. But Curtis himself, he didn't really throw like we'd seen against Brendan Allen or Phil Haas. So for Hermansson, it definitely is a good win. But again, Hermansson's a guy that's had the highest of highs. He's had main events. He's what? Is
this his Claudio Poyes if he's Dan Hooker?
No, well, Jack Hermansson's had 4 main events in the UFC.
So.
He's 1-3. He beat Souza. He lost to Cannonier, lost to Vittori, lost to Sean Strickland. Dolidze doesn't really fight like any of those guys, but Dolidze, for what it's worth, and we said this for quite a while, it was before the Trevin Giles fight, it was after the Trevin Giles fight. Roman Dolidze, when are you going to fight like when you were the light heavyweight champ with WWFC? When are you going to throw the spinning stuff? When are you going to throw with power? When are you going to cut the distance? When are you going to not worry about getting taken down to then push your offensive grappling? His last 2 fights, what does he do against Daukaus? Runs across, finishes him. What did he do when he fought Phil Haas not that long ago? Struck a little bit with him, switched stances, and that's the thing about Dolidze. He will switch his stances, and I do have it there, but if you look at Dolidze, Haas goes for the takedown. Dolidze kind of scrambles with it, grabs the leg, pops the knee, let's go with a submission.
It's filthy.
And then when Haas is back up, taking missteps, that's when Dolidze goes 1, 2, 3, drop him. And so Dolidze, again, looked really good in that one. I see it in the chat, like VT's talking about Haas. You've got Hermansson has no gas tank.
I disagree with that.
Yeah, he's had 4 main events, and they're 5-round fights, and there's been decisions. But for me, when I do look at this one, Matt, Hermansson's a good grappler. Dolidze, FILA champ in 2013. He was an ADCC trials winner in Oceania in 2016. Dolidze has that lights out quick grappling. Jack Hermansson will utilize the takedown, and he has really wonky submissions in his repertoire.
He's also got that, quick grappling. He didn't grapple for a long time with Gastelum or David Branch before he secured the submission. It's not like he got into the full guard and then Damian Maia'd them to get onto their back and then choked them out. He grabbed a limb and he yanked on it and he won. I do think Jack Hermansson has the edge in the grappling. I know that might be wild to say because Dolidze is a very high-level grappler in his own right. I just think it's easy to forget some of the submission wins Jack Hermansson does have on his resume because when he does fight the upper-level guys, I think it's fair to say, Jack Hermansson is not an elite middleweight. He's a good middleweight. And that's about it. He does have
very good.
I don't know if he even hits very good because, again, we've seen when he fights those guys in the top 5, if you're a really heavy power puncher who has good boxing, especially technique-wise, think about his fight against Jared Cannonier. Cannonier could keep him away, use his physicality to defend some of those takedowns. I think Roman Dolidze can use his physicality to defend some of those takedowns. I definitely don't think he can hurt Jack Hermansson the same way a guy like Jared Cannonier does because Dolidze does have good power, don't get me wrong. He doesn't have the technique behind some of that power, though, that the other guys that have had success against Jack Hermansson do have. Think about Marvin Vettori, too. Vettori, I know we talk about as a guy who strikes his way into the clinch, but in the fight against Jack Hermansson, it was a lot of jabs, a lot of straight lefts. He was very technical in that matchup, and that tends to be what Hermansson struggles with. That's why I think this matchup's so key, because for as good as Dolidze is, he's not a guy who's a very technical guy. You don't really look at a lot of other fighters in the UFC and say, wow, they fight like Roman Dolidze, so I'll be very curious to see how his style matches up against the more traditional Jack Hermansson.
If you watch Roman and his striking, you watch him from southpaw, because again, he is a switch-based fighter. If he's from southpaw, he's trying to throw the left high kick, and it's out there and it's gonna happen. He doesn't really throw much to set it up, but it's there to throw that kick. And when he goes over to orthodox, heavy right hand, and he can throw his right hand, it's either straight shot, he throws a hook, he can mix it up, overhand. He really is special in that regard. And if you look at it, 6 wins by knockout, 3 wins by submission on his ledger. But the biggest thing that I found out of it, and again, 2 performance bonuses last 2 times out, but Bisping said this in the Haas fight. He said that Dolidze took the Daukaus bonus money and put it on a little bakery that he has back home. So Roman Dolidze, just a bacon man. He's like Carlo. Carlo's all over Vegas, by the way. Carlo's Bakery, Carlo's Pizza, Carlo's everywhere. But Matt, we have a look at the odds in this one. We're not here to talk about bakeries and pizzerias.
No, it's been a long show.
Jack Hermansson, open -150, -190. Dolidze, open +130, +156.
I'm surprised to see the odds there.
We have a look. Again, November 22nd, this fight was announced. It was supposed to be Derek Brunson originally. We have a look at the Topology votes, Matt. Surprise to us there, to you. I'm going to say over-under 70% Hermansson.
I think they'll be over, I do.
They're under. Wow. 1,786 total votes, 60% Hermansson, 78% by decision. For the 40% that have Dolidze, 71% by knockout. Let us know in the comments section who you have in this fight. I have it as a tough one. I have Jack Hermansson, but again, I do have questions because he doesn't necessarily deal all that well with pressure and big power. And that's exactly what Roman Dolidze throws. And Dolidze is a game grappler if it touches the mat.
The thing I will say, though, is Dolidze's cardio is much more questionable than Jack Hermansson's, to whoever said Jack Hermansson has poor cardio. Hermansson, in the fight against Jauregui, really had to weaponize his own cardio and his own pace to win that fight. And I know he lost to Marvin Vettori, but that was a great fight. That was competitive back and forth. He landed some own good shots. And the thing about Hermansson is, I think you can knock him out in the first round, but it's harder to knock him out in the second and the third. He has to ease himself into the fight a little bit, because that's the thing. He'll be a little stiff going into some of these striking engagements, but once he does relax himself into the fight, he becomes a much better striker. So I do like Jack Hermansson in this matchup, but I think this will be a really fun fight.
From the Maritimes, that's the question. So both of us going with Hermansson in this one?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it really is a tough one, though. I think it's going to be a really fun fight for what it is worth. We have a look at our next one, Matt. This is one that people are really excited about. Tai Tuivasa is taking on Sergey Pavlovich, and I'm going to get it right out of the gate right now. I'm going to switch to the second graphic. They're both billed as southpaw. You watched Tai Tuivasa's last fight when he took on Cyril Gane. He was orthodox, landed a big-time hammer that dropped Cyril Gane, had a lot of success in that second round out of that knockdown, and then that was about it. The body kicks, the accumulation of volume, the jabs really caused him problems, and Gane's able to get a finish in that fight. If you look at it for Pavlovich, also billed as a southpaw, so I went back and watched these Pavlovich fights, because I thought, well, I don't remember him fighting as a southpaw. Against Lewis, Abdurahimov, Green, against Golm, he's fighting from orthodox, and he's having a ton of success with his right hand, and he really is. It's either he throws it as a hook, an overhand, or an uppercut. When he closes distance and lands the uppercut, he drops his opponent. So both these guys, ton of power. I'm not necessarily, again, I took southpaw from all the sites that say southpaw, but I'd be a little leery of calling them just definite southpaws.
I definitely think Tai Tuivasa is the more likely to switch stances, though. He'll do it a lot more within his fights, I guess, or even within combination. This is what I have to say about this fight. If we had fast forward 6 months after the Ciryl Gane performance and I saw what I saw based on Tai Tuivasa, it was a loss where he looked pretty good, all things considered. He dropped a guy who had never really been hurt on the feet before, a guy who had fought the likes of Alistair Overeem, Curtis Blades, like Biggie Boy, like Ciryl Gane's been around, he's fought some really good guys. Tai Tuivasa was able to do what none of those guys were able to do, and I did think he looked pretty good, all things considered, in that matchup, and I thought he looked good enough for me to pick him in a Sergey Pavlovich matchup if this fight was a little bit in the further. My only question mark in this fight is how is Tai Tuivasa's durability coming off of that Ciryl Gane fight, because he took a lot of shots. A lot of shots. And that's
a lot of them were body shots, though.
A lot of them were, but he still got knocked out primarily due to shots to the head. So for Tai Tuivasa, I think he is rushing back. But I will say this. I think he has the more technical striker than Sergey Pavlovich because he can strike with a higher variety of strikes. Pavlovich is going to come in here with a lot of boxing-heavy attacks, whereas Tai Tuivasa might not go for a lot of head kicks, but we've seen him go for flying knees in the UFC. He throws a lot of leg kicks. He throws elbows. He comes at you with a much more varied attack, and I think that would have been very key in this matchup because at range, you can see Tai Tuivasa having a lot of success with his kicks. Think about his fight against Junior Dos Santos. I know we have to go way back for that, but I know Tuivasa lost
Junior
that fight.
gave him some opportunities in that one.
But exactly, Tai Tuivasa had a lot of success with his own leg kicks in that fight. He had Junior Dos Santos on the back foot, really hesitant to take a step forward because anytime he put power on that leg, Tai would kick it and really make a big difference. I could see him having similar success that he did in the JDS fight against Pavlovich, to where at range, I heard you with the kicks, in close, I heard you with the elbows, a la Cyril Asker. Probably not a guy's name you thought you'd hear today.
France's own.
But my problem is, I just don't know if Tai Tuivasa's given himself enough time based off that last performance. And for Pavlovich, he has looked good in the UFC, but I will say this. I think it is hard to take a lot off his last performance against Derek Lewis, because Lewis basically got hit by one good shot and like covered up, and that was it. So for Pavlovich, we didn't really learn a lot based on that fight. I really had a hard time learning much based off that fight. It was an early stoppage, and let's just be honest, Derek Lewis didn't really want to be in there either, so a combination of those two things makes for an ugly performance either way. I just think for Pavlovich, this is the step up he desperately does need to not stay relevant in the division, but you know what I mean. It's been a long time coming for him. He made his UFC debut against Alistair Overeem.
And in that fight, Alistair was training at Elevation, and he tried to put the wrestling shoes on, and ultimately he was able to get Pavlovich up, get him down, and finish him with a ground and pound TKO.
And that's definitely what Pavlovich is going to struggle with when he fights these other top level guys, like Curtis Blades.
Yeah,
pretty
that's
difficult.
the next fight. Yeah,
that's a pretty difficult matchup for Pavlovich, but I feel like where they are in their careers right now, I do slightly favor Pavlovich just because he isn't as fresh off of a war as Tai Tuivasa.
No, like you look at it for Pavlovich, the fight that he had against Abdurakhimov, like all of his wins in the UFC, all of those first round finishes that he has, you go and you watch the method of victory, and he utilizes his length very well for this division. He's going to have, a 9-inch reach advantage in this fight, and he really does fight high guard, defends a lot of shots, and then he's out there throwing his own, and he throws great hooks. He has that great uppercut that, coming from that right hand, and he throws it, like I said, an overhand, a hook, and an uppercut. So it's a varied attack coming from Pavlovich, but we haven't really seen him need to switch stances. So that's what brings us to that graphic again. When you look at it from southpaw, well, they're both billed as southpaw. Pavlovich has been fighting orthodox in the UFC. Can he do it from southpaw? We'll see how it goes, and we'll see if those leg kicks play for Tuivasa. That loss to Ciryl Gane was back in September. So September, October, November, early December. We'll see how it plays out for him. But again, we're live. I made a noise. The body kicks really were a difference maker for Gane. Pavlovich doesn't really throw them. We have a look at this fight overall. We have a look at the odds. And if you do look at it that way, Pavlovich, holy smokes, he is a favorite. He opened like minus 115. He's a minus 222 right now. Tuivasa opened minus 105, plus 178. Matt, this is going to be fun. So we have a look at the Tapology vote. Surprise to us, they are to you. Okay, my pick is Sergey Pavlovich, and he's now a big favorite. So that's not much fun. I'm going to say over-under 75% Pavlovich.
I think it'll be under.
It's going to be under. It's under. So 2,055 total votes. 55% Pavlovich. 86% by knockout for the 45% that have Tuivasa. 90% by knockout. So let us know in the comments section who you have. But most have somebody by knockout.
If this fight was in 2 months, I would say Tai Tuivasa by knockout. Again, I do think the way that Pavlovich strikes is a big problem for himself in a matchup with Tuivasa. On the outside, you're going to get blasted by leg kicks, and Tai Tuivasa is not a guy who's only going to throw them a couple times and then just stop doing it. He's going to go back to that well over and over and over again. I do think that's going to be a big issue for Pavlovich. That's why I think this is going to be a difficult fight for him. Again, I've thrown up a lot of red flags based on Tai Tuivasa and based on the damage he took his last time out, but I do think stylistically he has a good style in this matchup. So So if he was more 100%, maybe he is 100%. Hell, I don't know. If this is 100% Tai Tuivasa, I would pick him. But based on the last performance and how fast we're coming off it, I do like Pavlovich in the matchup because I see it the way the Tapology voters do. I do. I think this is close to a 50-50 where whoever lands first is probably going to win by stoppage because they both carry that fight-ending power.
And I take Pavlovich by the method that I thought that Augusto Sakai was going to be able to do it. What's Augusto Sakai? Big, long, rangy guy. Has a lot of zip at the end of his shots, but he throws more volume. Hey, Sakai, that's going to be a good pick. And what did Tuivasa do? Crash the distance, got rid of all of that, sent him up against the cage, and Overeem did it to Pavlovich in his debut a few years ago. Maybe Tuivasa is able to do it. So not with the most confidence, but I do like Pavlovich. I like the varied combinations with the boxing. I think he can win out in this matchup, but would I be surprised if Tai Tuivasa won? Not a one bit. Matt, we're an hour and 48 minutes into this long fest. We have Matheus Nicolau taking on Matt Schnell, possible fight of the night. Now, I talked about this at the start of the video. Matt Schnell in 2022 is 1-1. He has a first-round submission loss to Brandon Royval. He has a second-round submission win over Suma Energy. On its face, none of that's all that crazy. Like, you're 1-1, you win by submission, you lose by submission. One-round fight, two-round fight, both fight of the nights. And the second fight, the one that he won, is number 5 on Topology's Fight of the Year. How wild is that for Matt Schnell?
It's absolutely insane. And for Matt Schnell, he has a very unique characteristic, and it's called having a rubber chin. And I don't mean that as a negative by any means. It is very much a bend but don't break kind of a style, because we've seen Schnell get knocked out in the past, don't get me wrong. Upper echelon, really big tier power punchers can hurt him. But in a lot of his fights, he's at least getting wobbled or stunned. And against a guy like Nicolau, you think that's probably going to play a factor at some point. Now, Schnell does have a massive advantage with his grappling in this matchup. He's a much more active grappler if this fight does hit the ground, but I think Nicolau is going to be able to land early and often in this matchup. That's my problem with Matt Schnell, and especially his striking defense. We've seen him just get rocked too many times, and at a certain point, the upper echelon guys in the division are just going to rock you. They're going to drop you and put you away, and I do think Nicolau, he might not be the best kind of knockout fighter in this division, but he's still a pretty darn good one at the end of the day, and he does carry that upper echelon power.
And we know it out of Nicolau. I mean, he did drop Bruno Correa a couple times. He got dropped in that fight as well. He dropped Louis Smolka like it was going out of style 3 times in their fight. He got dropped and finished by Dustin Ortiz and then cut from the promotion at 3-1 at the time. But he's 3-0 since he's come back. He had some good fights outside of the scene. He won a controversial decision over Manel Kopp. Of course, we all know this. 22 on MMA decisions, had a 29-28 Kopp. None of them had it for Nicolau, but Nicolau gets the win. He beats Tim Elliott in a close fight where Elliott's the only guy that's ever taken Nicolau down in the UFC, and he went 1-10 on his takedown attempts. So Nicolau, career in the UFC, has 93% takedown defense. And Nicolau, for what it's worth, his last time out against David Dvorak, his second round in that fight, he ends up getting the knockdown in that one, but he fakes the right hand, almost switches stances. It's like Jorge Masvidal. Fake right hand, almost switches stances, left hook, and it drops David Dvorak. And it was one of the most cartoony knockdowns I've ever seen in my life because Dvorak's like wobbling around and then he ends up falling down. So a really big one for Nicolau's last time out. He's a guy that trains out of Nova União, so you know you're going to have guys like Rafael dos Anjos is also on this card to train with, but Jose Aldo's trained there for the longest time. A lot of really good guys in the lower weight classes. But for Matheus Nicolau in this one, good takedown defense, good boxing, nice kicks against Matt Schnell, who's going to bring the kitchen sink at you in a fight.
He definitely is, but I feel like his ability to just get into a brawl and be happy brawling with a guy like Nicolau is definitely going to get him caught in this fight.
I'm eager to see it out of a guy like Schnell because he's been training close to home. I mean, you see it right there out of Heritage Muay Thai. His main coach, Eve Edwards, is there to coach, but Adrian Yanez to get ready for this fight, as well as Ralphion Stott. So two
good training partners.
Great guys to get ready for a fight against a guy like Matheus Nicolau. We have a look at the odds in this one for Nicolau. Holy smokes.
It makes sense, though.
No, wait, minus 400, minus 390, Nicolau.
You brought up the takedown defense stats of a guy like Nicolau. We've seen him fight Tim Elliott. Tim Elliott got to a title shot fighting like Matt Schnell. Matt Schnell does not fight like prime Tim Elliott whatsoever.
Matt Schnell plus 298, Matheus Nicolau minus 390. We have a look at the Topology votes. I guess there'll be a surprise to us there, to you. They're ranked one above one another, so I'm going to say over under 80% Nicolau.
I think they'll be over.
And they're over. 2022 total votes, 86% Nicolau, 71% by decision for the 14% that have Schnell, 42% by decision, 25% by submission, 22% by knockout. Those might not all add up, but Matt, what is it? The everybody seems to be going with Nicolau. I do have Nicolau in this fight, but it does worry me a little bit with that varied attack, with the power that can come into effect from Max Schnell. Maybe Schnell's able to catch him. I think Nicolau gets the win in this one based just solely on his technique, and he's a guy that really does stick to a game plan in a fight, and I like that in a matchup like this.
I just think Schnell's going to find himself walking into a lot of big power shots. He's going to have to close the distance to have his own success. Nicolau has good takedown defense. He has good footwork too. That's the thing. I know Dustin Ortiz is able to sort of disguise some of his own takedown attempts as strikes. I don't think Schnell's going to have that same level of success. I think Nicolau has improved quite a bit since that fight.
We'll see how it goes. Our co-main event of the evening. This has been a contentious one. We have Bryan Barberena, a real man at welterweight, take on Rafael dos Anjos, the former champ at 155. And for dos Anjos, we touched on it with Clay Guida. We touched on it with Darren Elkins. Like, there's guys that have their names in the rafters, so to speak, because of the records that they possess in the UFC. But if you look at it for RDA, he will most likely, unless we get a really quick finish, break Frankie Edgar's Ironman streak. And I know Edgar just retired, but RDA is sitting at 7 hours, 53 minutes, and 29 seconds of cage time in the UFC's octagon. Frankie Edgar, 7 hours, 57 minutes, and 10 seconds. So what is it? Just a little under 4 minutes. So if it goes over that, RDA is going to be able to break that record. He's truly 1-1 in Orlando, and if he gets to win this weekend, he'll be on 75% of all the Orlando cards. He lost to Habib, and he was able to beat Donald Cerrone. He had beaten Pettis for the belt. He beat Cerrone to retain, and then he lost Eddie Alvarez after that. But if you do look at it for RDA, just his last 2 fights, he got knocked out in the 5th round of his fight against Fiziev earlier on this year. He beat the Call of Duty god, Renato Moicano.
Great fight.
And that was a great fight on short notice at a catch weight of 160 pounds. So for Dos Anjos, making the move up to 170 pounds, I wonder how he's going to fare. Coming off that knockout loss against a guy in Bryan Barberena who's on a Legend Killer tour.
I'll be honest, I don't really like the move up to 170, and I will say why. And I'm going to contradict myself a couple of times, but I do have examples to defend my own point. RDA's not a good wrestler at 170. Like
he was against Robbie Lawler.
He didn't take him down that much in that fight. He struck with him a lot. He boxed him. He stood on the outside. He used his striking in that fight. The only guy he's wrestled at 170 is Kevin Lee, who was a blown-up 155er himself. But the weird thing is, the way for RDA to have the most success in this fight is by using his wrestling. But that's the weird thing about RDA in a lot of his matchups. It comes down to the physicality factor of RDA. If he's the bigger guy, he's going to be able to out-wrestle his opponent. Think of Renato Moicano. Again, that fight wasn't contested at 155. It wasn't contested at 170. It was one of those weird catch weights that the UFC is all of a sudden willing to do. But the thing is, if RDA is going to have success in this fight, I don't think he's going to get into one of those crazy barn burners like he did against Renato Moicano. We saw Bryan Barberena just get into one of those with Robbie Lawler, and I know Lawler is past his prime, that's why I picked Barberena in that matchup, but still, Barberena can bang on the outside. Like, he is a really good action fighter, and I know that's a very specific class of fighter, and it's not a fighter that you ever think is going to become a ranked fighter, but still, Barberena, I think, is going to be a very tough test for RDA, because again, if RDA is going to have a lot of success, if Jason Witt can out-wrestle Bryan Barberena, you would think RDA can too. But the thing is, Jason Witt is so much bigger than RDA, it's not even funny. And that's why I do think the physicality, is really going to be important between these two guys.
Well, and there's a couple of things about this fight, and I just realized I made a mistake on the graphic there because I have RDA 156 with a star. The star being, I guess that's not a mistake, the star being his last fight was at lightweight, this one is at welterweight, so that's why I put it there. But if you do look at it for Dos Anjos, the last fight against Fiziev, the scorecards, if there were scorecards, one had it 38-38, one had it 39-38, or 37, one had it 39-37. So he was on his way to losing a decision in that fight before he did get finished. That was back in July, and he only went 2 of 16 for his takedowns against Fiziev. And you'd think if somebody's going to beat Fiziev, it's got to be with some of those takedowns. But for Barberena, since his UFC debut in 2014, he went 2-0 over the Ellenbergers. He's 9-6 overall. But you look at the 5 fight of the nights that he has, and this is why this could be a fight of the night. One against Chad Laprise, one against Luque, one against Witt, one against Brown, one against Lawler. And the fights that he's had, the Brown fight, the Lawler fight, those are big wins. He's won 3 in a row. The other fight in there, it was the UFC debut of one Darian Weeks, a guy who had a little bit of success in the wrestling, a little bit of success with the hands, but ultimately it was Barberena getting the win. But again, he was at a wrestling disadvantage against Witt and against Brown, and he was able to get the win over both those guys. Although I know that fight against Matt Brown was a little contentious because he was a hometown guy in that one.
No, If we just talk about skills, like Allen Iverson was talking about practice, RDA's by far the more skilled fighter. He has more volume. He doesn't have more power, I wouldn't say. Like, he does have good pop to his shot, but Bryan Barberena puts a lot behind his punches, so I would say he has a bit of an edge in punching power, but they're close. I don't think either one of them is an outlier compared to the other. Again, I just keep on going back to the fact, RDA doesn't wrestle at this weight class a lot. He struggles wrestling guys at 170.
Like Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington?
Michael Chiesa was a 155er, and he mopped the floor with RDA in the grappling.
He looked good against Neil Magny.
Neil Magny struggles wrestling against everybody. My point is, RDA has only looked good wrestling against people who really struggle with it at this weight class, or who aren't physically have an advantage over him. I don't think he's going to have physical advantages over Bryan Barberena. We saw the odds while we were looking at another fight, and I know RDA is a 5-1 favorite right now.
I haven't seen it.
That is absolutely insane to me. Because
RDA open minus 325, minus 566, and Barberena open plus 275, plus 404.
This is what I mean. If RDA, and this is why I snapped a bit when you had said he wrestled Lawler. If Bryan Barberena fights like Robbie Lawler did, he's going to have a lot of success. Like, Bryan Barberena, if they get into one of those firefights, is going to look like Renato Moicano did in the 5th round against Rafael dos Anjos, because he's that much bigger naturally. He's going to hit with that much more pop in his shots. I just don't know if he's going to be able to defend the takedowns from RDA, because RDA is going to be dedicated to the wrestling. I think that's going to be the one thing about him in this game plan. I think RDA at least realizes that, okay, this is a dangerous guy to stand in the pocket with, to really exchange and brawl with. So I do think we are going to see a very grapple-heavy RDA, but that's why this is such a one way or another fight. It's either RDA has a ton of success with his grappling, or he gets a couple takedown attempts defended. We see Bryan Barberena start to land a body kick maybe that starts to bring RDA back down to earth. I just think this is a really difficult fight to predict, especially based on where the odds are.
Well, have a look at the Tapology votes, Matt. I'm going to say over-under, because, RDA is a giant favorite. I'm going to say over-under 80% RDA. They're probably going to be way over that.
I think they'll be over, but I definitely don't look at this fight that way.
Slightly over. 2,061 total votes, 82% RDA, 73% by decision for the 18% that are Barberena, 52% by knockout, 40% by decision. Let us know in the chat and in the comments who you have in this one, because, again, it is a tough fight. If you look at Barberena, look at his fight against Matt Brown. Despite the takedowns, he's landing power, and he's landing a lot of good shots. Same thing against Witt. And Witt, I don't care if it's his UFC debut. I think higher of him than most people do. I thought he had a competitive fight against Ian Machado Gary. But for Barberena, it was the compounding of the heavier strikes. His fight against Robbie Lawler, like, he was on cloud 9 his last time out. He looked really good. And, again, Lawler was coming off that Nick Diaz win. But if you look at it for Dos Anjos, he's 38. He's about to break Frankie Edgar's Ironman streak. You got a lot of miles in the cage if you've been in there for over 7 hours. So it's going to be an interesting one. Andy's talking about RDA's short legs. Going to have to get close and land them. And he's going to pay for it. So we'll see how it plays out that way. What's your pick here?
I think I've thrown up enough red tape to say that Bryan Barberena is definitely a live dog. I think he's going to make this fight very entertaining for as long as it lasts, because that's the thing about Barberena. Even if you do take him down, he's going to waste every ounce of energy trying to get back up to his feet. There's some fighters, like, I have some friends who don't follow the sport all that closely, and they think, because Chael Sonnen said this a few times, you only lose by rear naked choke if you give up. And to sometimes that can be true. You see guys, they just can't get up from the ground. It's kind of that deep water situation. Barberena's not that guy. Barberena's going to fight and give everything he possibly can in this matchup, and that's why I think it's a very difficult fight for RDA, because he's going to be the smaller man, but I think his wrestling will end up winning out. I think the pressure that he employs with his striking is going to help open up his wrestling attack.
We'll see how it plays out for RDA in this fight. I look back at it's probably I shouldn't, but that Witt fight, and it scares me a little bit for Barberena, but we'll see if the physicality from Witt compared to Dos Anjos plays out that way. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think it's going to be a really fun co-main event. It's going to go one way or the other. It's going to have you on the edge of your seat. And that brings us to, drumroll please, the main event of the evening. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson taking on the Trailblazer Kevin Holland. And I mentioned it off the top. Kevin Holland in main events, it's been a something. It's been a something. Because he was able to get there near the top of the mountain. He's had 3 so far. Marvin Vettori didn't go all that well. Derek Brunson didn't go all that well. But for Kevin Holland, it's been fun. And for Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, he's had 8 main events. He had the close first title fight. The second one not necessarily as close. But if you look at it for Thompson, it's been an interesting road since. You look at his fight against Chef Neal, you look at the fight against Anthony Pettis, you can kind of pick and choose some of these fights, but for Thompson, he's never been a guy that's been easy to hold down and easy to control on the ground, and his last 2 times out, Gilbert Burns has been able to do that, and a guy who's in Fuego. And Bilal Muhammad was definitely able to do that. So it's an interesting difference of styles now where Thompson doesn't have to take on a guy who's so good on the ground. Kevin Holland has good jiu-jitsu. Definitely. Kevin Holland has pretty good wrestling, all things considered, but Holland's not going to chain takedowns together like either of those two guys, or you wouldn't think he necessarily would. So if it's just on the feet, it's a great fight. If somebody mixes in the grappling, it's a really good fight too. But the best part about this one, Matt, for Wonderboy, Jack Black's going to walk him out. It's like UFC 189. Cool. Like when you had McGregor and Mendes getting walkout songs. For Kevin Holland, I don't know because I haven't really heard anything about walkouts, but his last time out, UFC 279, he walked out to Young Boy Never Broke Again's Ghost. So will that happen? NBA YB?
Could.
Maybe.
Got some good tunes. When was the last time Wonderboy fought a guy who was bigger than him? Because I cannot remember. And that's the weird thing. Wonderboy is always the guy who has those physical attributes that allow him to fight on the outside and be the counter striker. You have to work your way on the inside to him. He has great footwork. He doesn't have insane punching power by any means. And I think a lot of that does come down to hand injuries. Wonderboy's a guy who has dealt with a lot of hand injuries.
Darren Till, maybe? Woodley? Guys that were bigger than...
Woodley's short, though. Darren Till, I guess, would be the last guy. So there you go. There's a good example. I hope to God this is better than that Darren Till fight. But what I will say is, for the most part, Wonderboy is able to work off the back foot and be that counter striker. When you think about guys who do rush forward, think about Jeff Neal, think about Vicente Luque. Great strikers in their own right, but very different kinds of strikers. They really rely on their physicality, their aggression, and their volume to have a lot of success. Wonderboy is built to beat fighters like that because he can bounce around the cage. He can do that thing where he bounces his back off the cage and land a straight shot. He is very elusive in that manner, but I'll be very curious to see how he leads the dance, because when he had to do that against Darren Till, we didn't really get that great of a fight, and I think he's going to have to do that against Kevin Holland, because Holland might not be the kicker that Wonderboy is, because, let's be honest, nobody's the kicker Wonderboy is, but Kevin Holland has very good long-distance boxing. I always go back to the Joaquin Buckley fight that really demonstrates that, because Buckley's a guy who really likes to duck and then throw and really explode out of the shots. And we all know how good of a boxer and punching power Joaquin Buckley carries. Kevin Holland had a very mature performance in that fight. I know he was slapping him around and clowning him and stuff, but for the most part, he was countering him, landing straight shots down the middle, just showing technical boxing that you never really think of when you think about Kevin Holland. I always think about Kevin Holland as kind of looping shots a little bit. It might not always look clean, but it's always effective. I think Kevin Holland is going to have more success than you might assume on the feet in this matchup, but I still think he's going to go for a takedown at some point. I think Kevin Holland's going to try to work his way into the clinch, go for a takedown. I just don't know if he is the level of wrestler that can get over that Wonderboy wrestling check, because some of the great wrestlers in this division's history have had a hard time getting Wonderboy down. Remember Rory McDonald before Wonderboy had fought Tyron Woodley? Rory McDonald might not have been in his prime. It was right after the Lawler fight, but still, he couldn't take down Wonderboy to save his life.
No, and for Thompson, the thing that we've gotten away from, and Andy hits it right on the head in the comment section, Wonderboy by question mark kick. We always used to talk about this, and it was an example we'd use across weight classes. Stephen Thompson switching stances. It's so important because he throws different looks from either stance. Like I said, Roman Dolidze goes southpaw. Yeah, he does. He throws a left head kick and then he switches back to orthodox and he boxes.
Wonderboy's always right leg dominant.
Certain fighters do different things, but Wonderboy will throw different kicks with either foot depending on the stance, and he really does switch up his combinations. But for me, the fight that I went back and watched, and the one that I use as the example, I guess I'll say, is that Darren Till fight, because what did Darren Till do to a T in that one? What did he have his most success when he was moving up through? Doing his weird load up. But what he did was he cloaked his shots with his load up. And if you watch the one that drops Thompson, he does his little thing like this where he loads up, and then he southpaw, double jab, backs up Thompson, snaps his head back, and then as Wonderboy's trying to round out, he throws a left hand and it catches Wonderboy behind the ear and drops him.
I still thought Wonderboy won that fight.
Yeah, and I know, and a lot of people did, and maybe,
that's the thing about Wonderboy. He's not a great knockout puncher when he's leading the dance. He isn't a great move forward kind of guy, and normally that's the part of the game that you learn first. You learn how to go forward and be aggressive, and then you learn the defense. Wonderboy is the complete opposite of that. He is a great fighter moving backwards, but if you wait on him and try to out-counter the counter striker, you can have a lot of success.
And the best part about that fight, Matt, and I think you'll enjoy this, was the fight that you had in that Till Wonderboy fight. These are two slippery and sweaty guys in the 5th round by Brendan Fitzgerald. So he really just nailed it in that one. So we'll have to see again, and I can see it in the comments section, can the kicks of Thompson really kind of break up the flow of Kevin Holland? and get rid of that reach advantage that he has, or will the physicality of Holland and the varied boxing attacks mixed in with his kicks and possibly the takedowns win it for Kevin Holland? Those are really all the angles that you can cover in this one. The odds in the fight, Kevin Holland's the favorite, open at par, -164. Wonderboy, open at par, +135. We have a look at your votes here in the chat because we can do that. And 65% of you have Kevin Holland to get the win. So we'll go with you guys in the chat. Slight majority going with Kevin Holland to get the win. He is slightly favored to win the fight. Do you think he's going to win the fight?
I agree with what Drake Levy says, honestly. Wonderboy has run into a lot of guys in the past who can hurt him on the feet, but then what do? He bounces right back up, and then they kind of go back to their weird stalemate, where it's okay, I may have landed the one more damaging shot this round, but everything else is going to be pretty close. Kevin Holland's one of the unique fighters who, where if he does hurt Wonderboy, boom, he can immediately get on top of him and submit him. So I think for Kevin Holland, we might not see a lot of his offensive wrestling. We might only see his grappling if he is able to hurt Wonderboy on the feet. But I do feel like with his own physical advantages and with the fact that I think he can wait on the back foot, counter with his own boxing off of some of the kicks of Wonderboy, I like Kevin Holland in the matchup.
I like Kevin Holland as well. And listen, it's 15 total fights. We rip through it all in one go. We'll separate them as separate videos tomorrow on Friday. So you'll have that drop of all of those 15. But we don't clog your inbox because we only send notifications for some of the bigger ones. So make sure you check all of those out. A like is definitely appreciated. Question Mark Kicks is on Saturday, 2 hours before the prelims start. So we get an opportunity to go back, look at the weigh-ins, look at the two guys facing off. I know I had a couple of them where I thought, like the Scott Holtzman fight where he's taking on Clay Guida. I want to see those two guys face off when they fight. Did I get that one right? There's so many legends and There's 15
If you
freaking
think I
fights.
remember a graphic from something we talked about an
yes,
hour and a half
it was
ago.
that fight. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And then, of course, you have UFC 282, which is a weird main event. Jan Blachowicz taking on Ankalaev. No more Glover Teixeira. Apparently he's out of the picture. I would have loved to have seen the rematch between him and Jan, but that is what it is. I know you're really looking forward to the fights that are coming up, Matt, this weekend, because it's not necessarily quantity over quality. It's a mix of both.
Oh, definitely. Like you had mentioned, there's 11 ranked fighters on this card, and it feels like we went through quite a few fight night cards where it was, hey, only the fighters in the main event are ranked. So I feel like this is a very deep fight night card that I'm really excited for.
And Mikey G likes to see the final thoughts that we have on it. This is a new thing for us here, just ending it, having fun, and, looking at some of these fights. So listen, you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, and as we always say, let's get into it.
Ladies and gentlemen, recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. It's time for Fight Night Picks with your hosts, Frank and Matt.